The rope creaked in the cold February dark, a sound swallowed by the Missouri woods. The body of Ben Bolin swung from the limb of a white oak, a grim pendulum marking the end of a bloody Ozark chapter. To the men who put him there, he was a monster, a tyrant who terrorized the hills under the guise of justice. But just a few years earlier, many of those same men, or their neighbors, would have called him a savior, a dark angel sent to deliver them from chaos. So which was he? A righteous crusader who lost his way? Or a brutal killer who simply found the right mask to wear? Today, we're not just telling the story of a vigilante's death. We're peeling back over 100 years of rumor and legend to find the man himself, to understand how the iron fist of the bald Nobbers became a ghost, forever riding the haunted backroads of the Ozarks. To understand the firestorm that was the bald Nobbers, you must first walk through the world they burned down. Imagine the Ozarks in the 1880s. This wasn't a land of gentle hills and quaint cabins. It was a fortress built by nature. Light struggled to pierce the dense canopy of oak and hickory, leaving the hollows in a state of perpetual twilight. Creeks cut through limestone like silver knives, their waters running cold and clear. A man could get lost a mile from his own home and never be found. The land was beautiful, but it was a hard, unforgiving beauty that demanded respect and bred a deep sense of isolation. The people were as rugged as the land they worked. They were farmers, loggers, and hunters, their hands calloused and their faces etched by sun and hardship. Their lives were governed by the rhythm of the seasons, ploughing the rocky soil in the spring, enduring the suffocating humidity of summer, harvesting their meager crops in the fall, and hunkering down for the long, cold winter. Their world was small, often no larger than the valley where they were born. A trip to the county seat in Forsyth was a major event. The law, headquartered in some far-off city like Springfield, was less than a rumor. It was a ghost, a thing that had no power here. But beneath this quiet surface of toil and survival, the poison of the past was still at work. The Civil War had never truly ended in these hills. It had simply shattered into 1,000 personal feuds. Neighbor had fought neighbor as bushwhackers and jayhawkers, and the memories of burned-out farms and midnight raids were passed down from father to son like a cursed inheritance. Trust was a rare commodity, usually reserved for immediate kin. At night, heavy wooden bars were dropped across cabin doors, and the sound of an unfamiliar horse was enough to make a man reach for the rifle he kept over the mantel. This simmering fear created a vacuum, and into that vacuum crept a new kind of evil. Gangs of thieves and cutthroats, like the notorious Taylor brothers, roamed the countryside, preying on the very people the law was supposed to protect. They stole livestock, burned barns, and terrorized families, knowing there would be no consequences. Decent folk felt helpless, trapped between the ghosts of old hatreds and the very real threat of modern outlaws. They were good people pushed to the edge, praying for a savior. And in the smoky corners of general stores and under the shade of churchyard oaks, a dangerous idea began to take root. It was whispered at first, a desperate question passed between men who were tired of being afraid. If the law wouldn't protect them, who would? If justice was blind or simply too far away, then perhaps it was time for them to create their own. They didn't know it yet, but they were laying the foundation for a movement that would offer them salvation with one hand and deliver damnation with the other. The storm was gathering, and its name was justice. The Ozarks weren't settled, they were conquered. Not from some foreign power, but from the wilderness itself. The families that put down roots here in the generations before the war were mostly Scots-Irish, a people known for their fierce independence and a deep-seated suspicion of any authority they didn't create themselves. They weren't given land grants from a distant king. They earned their homesteads with an axe, a plow, and a rifle. Every field cleared of rocks, every cabin raised log by log, was a testament to their grit. This land wasn't just property to them. It was a part of their identity, paid for in sweat and blood. To threaten a man's land was to threaten his very soul. Then came the Civil War, and it fell on these hills not like a conventional war, but like a plague. Missouri was a border state, and that border ran straight through the heart of every family and every town. This wasn't a war of blue and gray armies marching in formation. It was the war of the torch and the rope. It was a war of neighbors. Confederate sympathizers formed guerrilla bands known as bushwhackers, while Union men became jayhawkers. They didn't fight over grand strategy. They fought over livestock, loyalties, and long-held grudges. A midnight raid could leave a family homeless, or worse. The violence was intimate, personal, and it left scars that wouldn't heal for a century. When the war officially ended in 1865, the fighting in the Ozarks didn't stop. It just lost its flag. The men who had spent 4 years living by the gun found they couldn't simply go back to the plow. Some of the most brutal bushwhackers and jayhawkers simply became outlaws, continuing their reign of terror without the thin veil of military cause. They knew the secret paths, the hidden hollows, and the fear in people's hearts. They were the war's bitter harvest, and they choked the life out of the fragile peace. This is where the weight of a name became a life or death matter. A family name in Taney County wasn't just a label, it was a history. It told people where your father stood in the war. It whispered of old debts and unsettled scores. To be a Taylor was to carry the reputation of Confederate defiance and post-war banditry. To be a Kinney suggested a history of staunch unionism. Long before the bald knobbers ever pulled on their masks, the battle lines were already drawn, etched into the landscape by the ghosts of the war. The conflict to come wasn't new. It was simply the old feud, waiting for a spark to set the hills ablaze once more. In the center of this simmering pot was Nat Kinney. He wasn't a vigilante by nature. He was a Union veteran, a respected farmer, and the Sunday school superintendent. People listened when he spoke. He saw the moral decay, the fear in his neighbors' eyes, and it offended his sense of order. On the other side were men like the Taylor brothers, who swaggered through the county as if they owned it. They and their associates were the festering wound, a constant source of trouble, known for their love of whiskey, brawling, and taking whatever they pleased. They were the embodiment of the lawlessness that Kinney and other decent folk were growing to despise. The conflict didn't start with a gunshot, but with 1,000 smaller cuts. An old farmer's fence would be cut in the night, his cattle scattered for miles. A man who spoke too loudly against the outlaws in the Kirbyville saloon would find his corn crib burned to the ground a week later. These weren't random acts, they were messages. One of the most galling incidents involved a public fistfight where one of the Taylors brutally beat a younger man over a perceived slight, all while the local constable conveniently looked the other way. The message was clear. There is no law here but us. Fear is a patient poison, and it spreads through whispers. In the general store, while weighing out flour and salt, men would speak in low tones. Heard the Taylors were seen near John Green's place, right before his best mule went missing. At church socials, women would exchange worried glances, sharing stories of strange riders seen on the road after dusk. Every unsolved theft, every act of vandalism was laid at the feet of the same handful of families. Rumor hardened into fact, and suspicion curdled into a collective certainty. This constant drip of intimidation and gossip created a siege mentality. The community wasn't just being attacked from the outside, it was rotting from within. The outlaws were emboldened by the lack of consequences, and the law-abiding majority felt increasingly isolated and powerless. The air in Taney County grew thick with a toxic mix of fear and resentment. It wasn't just about stolen property anymore. It was about honor, dignity, and the terrifying realization that if they didn't draw a line in the dirt themselves, the tide of violence and chaos would soon wash away their homes, their families, and their entire way of life. The winter of 1884 bled into the spring of 1885 with a strange and heavy feeling in the air. The old folks, who read the land like a book, saw bad signs everywhere. They said the woods themselves seemed to hold their breath. Panthers screamed from the high ridges with an unusual frequency, their cries sounding almost human. The screech owl, the death bird of Ozark lore, was heard calling from the eaves of more than one cabin, a sound believed to foretell a coming tragedy. A sudden violent hailstorm in late March flattened the first green shoots of corn, and men looked at the bruised sky and muttered that it was a sign of God's displeasure. But the true omen wasn't in the sky or the woods. It walked on two legs and reeked of cheap whiskey. The Taylor gang and their ilk grew bolder, their crimes escalating from nighttime thievery to brazen daylight intimidation. The final straw came when one of their crew publicly horsewhipped a well-respected farmer in front of his own family over a disputed line fence. They didn't just injure the man, they humiliated him, stripping him of his dignity in the eyes of his children and neighbors. The act was a declaration: "We are the law, and your honor means nothing to us." It sent a shockwave of rage and fear through the county. This was the moment that dread became a living thing. You could see it in the eyes of men like Nat Kinney. He felt the immense pressure from his community to do something, to lead them out of the darkness. But as he looked at the hard, desperate faces of his friends and neighbors, he felt a chilling premonition. It was a gut-wrenching feeling that in order to fight the monsters who plagued their hills, they would have to become monstrous themselves. He knew that the path they were about to choose was a one-way road, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it led straight into a darkness from which none of them would ever truly return. The public humiliation of a good man was the spark that finally lit the fuse. For Nat Kinney, the time for talk was over. Word was sent out, not by letter, but by quiet visits after dark. A trusted friend would ride to a neighbor's cabin, speak a few hushed words on the porch, and then melt back into the night. The message was simple: be on the Bald Knob, east of town, after midnight. Come alone and come armed. There was no need to explain what it was about. Every man who received the summons knew in his bones that the time for choosing a side had arrived. They gathered under a cold, star-dusted sky on a treeless hill that would give them their name. They were ghosts in the moonlight, emerging from the woods in twos and threes, rifles cradled in their arms. These were not criminals. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and church-going men, their faces grim and set. At the center of the clearing, a small bonfire crackled, casting their long, dancing shadows across the barren ground. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind and the nervous shuffling of boots on stone. Nat Kinney stood before them, his large frame silhouetted against the flames. His voice, when he spoke, was not a shout, but a low, steady rumble that carried a weight of cold fury. He spoke of the law that had abandoned them, of the thugs who terrorized their wives and children, and of the honor that was being stripped from them, piece by painful piece. "The law won't protect us," he declared, his words cutting through the night air. "So we will become the law. We will be the answer to our own prayers. We will sweep this county clean of the filth that infests it, or we will die trying." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. This was what they had been waiting for: a leader, a plan, a cause. Kinney had them raise their right hands, and there, in the flickering firelight, they swore a solemn oath. They swore secrecy upon pain of death. They swore loyalty to one another, and they swore to mete out justice with rope and switch to any man who threatened their homes and their peace. In that moment, they ceased to be individual farmers. They became a single entity, a phantom army born of desperation and rage. They were the Bald Knobbers, and as the men dispersed, melting back into the darkness from which they came, a new and terrible power was unleashed upon the Ozarks. They had a name, an oath, and a list of targets. Among them stood men like Ben Bolin, his hands still tingling from the oath, his mind already turning to the work ahead. He and his brothers were not thinkers like Kinney. They were doers. The first drops of blood had not yet been spilt, but the promise had been made. The hunt was about to begin, and the hills would soon echo with the sounds of their swift, brutal justice. Their justice was a terrifying ritual, repeated in dozens of darkened hollows. It always began with the sound, a low thunder that started far off and grew steadily closer. It was the sound of shod hooves, dozens of them, moving as one through the night. To the family huddled inside their cabin, it was the sound of a coming judgment. The dogs would bark themselves into a frenzy, then fall eerily silent as the phantom army surrounded the home. And then, the waiting. A silence so heavy you could feel it pressing in on the log walls. From the darkness would come a single, commanding voice, often rough and distorted by the flannel mask. "Come out, or we're coming in." Inside, a man would have to make a choice that was no choice at all. To surrender was to face the switch, the tar, the rope. To resist was to invite something far worse. This ritual of fear was the bald knobber's true weapon, and for a time, it worked. They drove out the worst of the outlaws and brought a fragile, terror-enforced peace to the hills. But the night they rode on William Edens, the ritual changed. Edens was not a notorious outlaw. He was just a man who had defied them, who had spoken out against their methods. He refused to be intimidated. When the thunder of hooves surrounded his cabin and the voice called out, Edens refused to open his door. He would not surrender his home to masked men. From inside, his family heard him shout his defiance into the darkness. What happened next was not justice, it was an execution. The night didn't just splinter with the sound of a kicked-in door. It exploded in a blinding, deafening roar. A volley of rifle and shotgun fire ripped through the thin wooden walls of the cabin. To the children cowering on the floor, the world became nothing but the flash of muzzles painting terrifying momentary pictures in the dark, the scream of lead tearing through wood and the smell of gunpowder filling their lungs. The air itself seemed to shred around them. When the shooting stopped, the silence that rushed back in was profound and absolute. Heavy boots stomped onto the porch. The remnants of the door were torn from its hinges. Through the smoke and darkness, the family saw only hulking shapes, demonic silhouettes against the moonlight, as their father was dragged from the home he had tried to defend. There was a final, terrible struggle in the yard, a woman's desperate plea cut short. Another shot rang out, sharp and final, and its echo was the only eulogy William Edens would receive. The next morning, when the neighbors arrived, they found a scene of unimaginable horror. They didn't need to see the body to understand what had happened. The cabin itself was the testament. It looked as if it had been clawed by some great furious beast. The log walls were pockmarked with dozens of dark, ugly holes, silent witnesses to the chaos. This was not a whipping. This was not a warning. This was murder, cold and brutal. On that night, the bald knobbers crossed a line, and in the blood of William Edens, their righteous crusade was drowned forever. The saviors had become the monsters. To understand what happened at the Edens cabin, you have to try for a moment to look through Ben Bolin's eyes. In his mind, he wasn't a murderer. He was a surgeon, and the Ozarks were his patient, riddled with the cancer of lawlessness. A tumor doesn't have rights. You don't reason with it. You cut it out, cauterize the wound, and move on. The Taylors and their kind were the primary tumor, but men like William Edens, men who defied the cure, who obstructed the surgery, were part of the disease too. In Bolin's brutally simple logic, if you weren't actively helping to save the patient, you were helping the sickness spread. The switch didn't flip for Ben Bolin on the night of the Edens murder. It had been welded into position the moment he took the oath on that bald knob. While other men, perhaps even Kinney, saw their night riding as a temporary necessary evil, Bolin saw it as a righteous calling. He was the hammer, and it was not the hammer's place to question the nail. Each whipping, each threat, each act of terror was simply a tool for the job. He likely felt contempt for the weakness he saw in others, for the men who flinched at the sound of a switch on bare skin. They didn't have his clarity. They didn't understand that to fight monsters, you must be more terrifying than any monster. So when William Edens shouted his defiance from behind that door, Bolin didn't hear a brave man defending his home. He heard the sickness talking back. He heard a direct challenge to the new order, the only order that could save them. The hail of gunfire that shredded the cabin wasn't a moment of lost control. It was a calculated, overwhelming response to that challenge. It was a message, written in lead and smoke, not just for Edens, but for anyone else who thought they could stand in the way. This was the cold calculus of his crusade. After the final shot echoed into silence, as the other masked men stood in the shocked aftermath, Ben Bolin likely felt no remorse. He wouldn't have felt the thrill of a killer, nor the chilling emptiness of a man who has lost his soul. He would have felt the quiet, grim satisfaction of a job well done. A problem had been solved, a lesson had been taught. He was the iron fist of the bald nobbers, and that night the fist had come down hard. In his own mind, he hadn't committed a crime. He had enforced the only law that mattered. Dawn broke over the Edens homestead, but the light brought no comfort. It only served to illuminate the full scope of the horror. The silence that had followed the final gunshot was a heavy, suffocating blanket. The first neighbors to arrive walked onto the property as if treading on cursed ground. They saw the cabin first, its log walls looking like they had contracted some terrible disease, a pox of dark bullet holes. On the porch, a shattered butter churn lay on its side, a mundane casualty in a night of unimaginable violence. Inside, they found what was left of the Edens family. The widow sat on a low stool, not weeping, but staring into a space beyond the walls, her mind shattered by the events she had been forced to witness. The children were huddled together in a corner, their faces pale and streaked with soot, their eyes wide with a terror that might never leave them. But it was in the yard, lying in the cold, dew-covered dirt, that the finality of the act was laid bare. William Edens was dead, and the bald nobbers had killed him. But they had made a fatal mistake. In their furious volley, they had also shot Charles Green, Edens' son-in-law. They had left him for dead, but he wasn't. He had survived. Wounded and bleeding, he was a living witness to the slaughter. And more importantly, he had recognized some of the men behind their crude flannel masks. He knew their voices. He knew their names. His survival was a ticking clock, and with every breath he took, the bald nobber's reign of terror was 1 second closer to its end. The news of the murder didn't spread as a whisper. It tore through the Ozark Hills on a current of shock and rage. This was different from the stories of whippings and warnings. This was a line crossed in blood. The story reached the courthouse in Forsyth, and from there it traveled by telegraph to the state capital. The tale of the bullet-riddled cabin and the defiant man murdered in front of his family was so brutal, so brazen, that the state of Missouri could no longer afford to look the other way. The law, which had been a distant rumor for so long, finally awoke with a vengeance. The governor authorized the militia. Warrants were drawn up, bearing the names of the most prominent bald nobbers, including Nat Kinney and the Bolin brothers. A substantial reward was offered for their capture, dead or alive. The official documents went up on posts and walls in every town, turning the masked riders from a secret society into a list of wanted men. The hunters had become the hunted. The murder of William Edens split Taney County down the middle like an axe splitting a log. There was no more middle ground, no room for quiet neutrality. You were either for the nobbers or against them, and you had to choose a side right now. The pot-bellied stove at the general store, once a place for shared stories and friendly gossip, now radiated a cold silence. Men who had known each other since childhood would now pass on the road with a curt nod, their eyes hard, each wondering if the other had been among the masked riders that night. The church itself was divided, with some praying for the souls of the Vigilantes and others praying for their swift damnation. From the ashes of this division, an opposing force rose up, calling themselves the anti-bald nobbers. They were not lawmen. They were the friends and family of men who had been wronged by the nobbers, joined by those who were simply horrified by the Edens killing. They armed themselves and swore their own oaths, promising to hunt down the Vigilantes and deliver a justice of their own. The old Civil War feud was reborn, but this time without uniforms. It was neighbor against neighbor once more, and the hills became a checkerboard of loyalty and hate, where taking the wrong path or trusting the wrong person could get a man killed. A thick, suffocating fear settled over the county, creating a conspiracy of silence. Many people knew the truth. They had seen the riders gather, heard the boasts in a saloon, or recognized a man's horse tied up outside the Eden's place. But the bold nobbers' power, even when they were fugitives, was immense. Their kin were everywhere, and the threat of a burning barn or a midnight visit was far more immediate than the protection of a distant law. When the sheriff and his deputies came asking questions, men would suddenly suffer from bad memories, their eyes cast down to the floorboards. To speak the truth was an act of incredible courage, because everyone knew the nobbers had a very simple law for informants. Amidst this climate of fear, small acts of profound courage and startling cowardice played out in the shadows. One neighbor, at great risk to his own family, would leave a basket of bread and salted pork on the Eden's widow's porch before dawn, a silent gesture of support. But another man, bound by blood or fear, would stand before a magistrate and provide a false alibi for his cousin, swearing he was playing cards with him on the night of the murder. The community was tearing itself apart at the seams, its moral fabric tested and frayed. It was in this fractured, paranoid landscape that the real hunt for Ben Bolin and his brothers would have to begin. While the official law, the state militia, and the county sheriff made a great show of organizing and searching, they were outsiders. They knew the main roads, but they didn't know the hollows. But the real hunters, the men who moved with a purpose that was colder and sharper than any legal duty, were the anti-bald nobbers. These were men who had lived in the shadow of the nobbers' terror. They weren't hunting for a reward, they were hunting for revenge. And they knew the mountains just as well as the men they were chasing. For months, Ben Bolin and his brothers were ghosts. They slipped through the deep woods and limestone caves they had known since childhood, a landscape that was now both their sanctuary and their cage. They reverted to a primal existence, living off poached deer and foraged nuts, their clothes turning to rags. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves in the wind sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. They tasted paranoia in every bite of squirrel meat and felt it in the cold dampness of the caves where they slept. The familiar woods, the kingdom they once ruled with masked terror, had become a labyrinthine prison. The hunt was a slow, methodical strangulation. The anti-bald nobbers were patient. They had men among them who could track a single man across solid rock and read a broken twig like a page in a book. They moved in small, quiet groups, checking the remote cabins of known sympathizers, finding the faint traces of a recent campfire, and slowly, painstakingly, tightening the net. A farmer who gave the Bolins a slice of cornbread might find his fence cut the next week, a quiet message that help was no longer an option. The fugitive's world shrank with every passing day. The end for Ben Bolin came not in a hail of bullets, but in a moment of exhaustion. It was February 1889, and the cold had gnawed at him for months. He had risked getting close to his brother's cabin, perhaps seeking a moment of warmth, a real meal, a sliver of the life he had lost. It was a fatal mistake. A tracker for the anti-bald nobber posse had found his trail in the thin layer of snow. They didn't storm the cabin. They simply waited, melting into the grey woods, becoming part of the landscape. When Bolin stepped outside, perhaps to fetch water or check the perimeter, he was allowed to walk 20 yards into the clearing. Then, a single voice cut through the cold air. "That's far enough, Ben." He froze. From behind every large oak and limestone outcrop, a man rose, rifle already at his shoulder. There was no shouting, no chaos, just the quiet final click of a dozen rifle hammers being pulled back. In that instant, Ben Bolin, The enforcer, the Iron Fist, saw the faces of his neighbors, his enemies, and knew that his war was over. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just stood there, a gaunt, tired man surrounded by the cold, unforgiving justice of the hills he once ruled. There would be no judge in a black robe for Ben Bolin. There would be no clever lawyers arguing points of law, no jury of his peers weighing evidence in a dusty box. The men who captured him, the anti-bald nobbers, had seen what passed for justice in the Ozarks. They had seen how a well-connected man could intimidate witnesses, how a sympathetic jury could ignore facts, how the slow, clumsy machine of the law could let a monster slip through its gears. They didn't trust it. They believed that to bring a man like Ben Bolin into a courtroom would be to mock the memory of William Edens. They had decided in the cold silence of the woods that Bolin would face a different kind of court. His trial was the long, grim ride from the place of his capture to a sturdy white oak tree on the side of a lonely road. The woods were his courtroom, the pale moonlight his only illumination. The jury was the silent procession of armed men on horseback who rode beside and behind him, their faces set like stone. There was no testimony offered, no evidence presented, because in their minds the case had been proven long ago, in the bullet holes of the Edens cabin, in the terrorized eyes of his family, and in the arrogance of the masked crusade Bolin had helped lead. Through it all, Ben Bolin remained unbroken. He did not beg for his life or plead for mercy. Accounts passed down through the generations say he sat tall in the saddle, his hands bound tight behind him, his gaze fixed straight ahead. His silence was his final act of defiance. He had lived his life by a code of brutal, unforgiving strength, and he would not abandon it in the face of death. He looked at the hard faces of his captors, not with fear, but with a quiet, burning contempt. He was a wolf cornered by hounds, and he would grant them no satisfaction. The verdict was delivered without a single word being spoken. When the posse stopped under the thick, bare limbs of the oak tree, the judgment was clear. They didn't grant him a final prayer or a chance for last words. The justice they dispensed was as swift and impersonal as the justice he had once delivered with a hickory switch. The rough hemp of the rope was thrown over a branch. The noose, tied with an efficient knot, was slipped over his head and cinched tight against his neck. A sharp slap on the rump of his horse, and it was over. Ben Bolin, the Iron Fist of the bald nobbers, was executed by the very vigilante justice he had championed. The question that hangs in the air, even to this day, is a chilling one. Was this justice? Or was it just another murder, another link in an endless chain of Ozark violence? The anti-bald nobbers had rid the world of a man they saw as a tyrant, but in doing so, they had become a mob, acting as their own judge, jury, and executioner. For the other captured bald nobbers, the official law would have its day in the Forsyth courthouse. But for Ben Bolin, the verdict had already been rendered, not by the law of men, but by the cold, hard law of the mountains. Ben Bolin's death was not the end of the story. It was merely the end of a chapter written in rope and vengeance. The consequences of the bald nobber war continued to ripple through the hills for years, leaving behind a landscape of broken lives and bitter silence. For the survivors of the Edens family, the mountains that had been their home became a prison of memory. Every creek, every ridge, every shadow held a piece of the horror they had endured. They could not rebuild their lives on ground soaked with their own blood and grief. Sometime after the trials, they packed what little they had left, turned their backs on Taney County, and vanished, seeking a place where the name Edens didn't echo with tragedy. For the other captured bald nobbers, the law of men finally arrived in Forsyth. The trial was a spectacle, the biggest in the county's history. And in May of 1889, 3 men, Dave Walker, his son William, and John Matthews, were led to a specially built gallows in the courthouse square. Before a crowd of thousands, they paid the ultimate price. their public execution serving as the state's final, brutal statement that the reign of the masked riders was over. But for the dozens of other nobbers who were acquitted or never charged, their freedom was a curse of its own. They walked out of the courtroom not into the arms of a grateful community, but into a life sentence of suspicion and contempt. These men, who had once been the secret kings of the night, now lived as pariahs in the daylight. Neighbors who had once feared them now simply shunned them. Their businesses failed, their crops seemed to wither on the vine, and they were met with the justice of cold shoulders and closed doors. They were haunted men, forever looking over their shoulders, wondering if every stranger on the road was a relative of someone they had wronged. Some stories say a few of them met quiet, untimely ends years later. A hunting accident, a fall from a bluff, accidents that no one ever questioned too closely. They had escaped the hangman's noose, only to find a slower, colder justice waiting for them in the unforgiving memory of their neighbors. And so, the community, exhausted by hate and bloodshed, made a collective, unspoken decision to forget. The name Bald Nobber became a curse, a word not to be spoken aloud. The grotesque horned masks were burned in secret, the records of their meetings buried or destroyed. Parents stopped telling their children the full, bloody story, opting instead for a vague tale of troubles in the old days. They tried to plow over the history, to plant a new crop of peace and pretend the soil beneath wasn't filled with bones. They wrapped the entire saga in a thick blanket of silence, hoping that if they didn't speak its name, the monster they had created would finally die. The forced silence that fell over Taney County could never last. A story this soaked in blood has a way of seeping back up through the ground. Walk through the Ozark Hills today, and you will still find the old names, Bolin, Kinney, Taylor, on mailboxes and in the phone book. The descendants of the riders and their enemies now share pews in the same churches and shop in the same stores. The blood feud is long over, the wounds scabbed over by generations of peace. But the echo remains. To carry one of those names is to carry a piece of that violent history, a faint whisper of a time when your great-grandfather might have been either the masked man on the horse or the one bolting his door in fear. The physical scars on the land have faded more slowly. For decades, the white oak where Ben Bolin was lynched stood as a dark monument on the side of the road. Locals knew it as the Bolin tree, and it became a place of dread, a landmark to be passed quickly, especially after dark. It was said that nothing would grow in its shadow. Eventually, time and nature did what the community could not. The old tree withered, died, and was cut down, its wood likely burned to ash. But even today, the old-timers can still point to the exact spot where it stood. The tree is gone, but the ground remembers. In the town of Forsyth, the old courthouse where the other nobbers were tried is gone, replaced by a new one. But in the local cemetery, you can find the graves of the 3 men who were legally hanged. Their tombstones are simple, weathered by 100 Missouri winters, giving no hint of the spectacle of their deaths. They are quiet, stone reminders of a time when the law finally brought its terrible, formal power to bear on the chaos. But the most powerful remnant of Ben Bolin isn't made of wood or stone, it is the ghost story. As the facts were buried under the community's silence, the man was replaced by the myth. History became folklore. To this day, on the dark roads around where he was killed, people still tell stories of the Phantom Rider, a lone, gaunt figure on horseback, seen on moonless nights, forever repeating his last fatal ride. Ben Bolin the man is dead and gone, but Ben Bolin the spectre became immortal, a cautionary tale whispered to children to keep them from straying too far into the woods after dark. The people tried to forget, but the story simply refused to die. So we come back to the question that hung in the air at the very beginning, a question that has haunted these hills for over a century. Was Ben Bolin a righteous crusader who lost his way? Or was he a brutal killer who simply found the right mask to wear? The honest truth, buried under years of myth and silence, is that he was both. He was the inevitable and terrible answer to the chaos that surrounded him. He was a man forged in the crucible of a lawless land, and he became the very thing he sought to destroy. The story of Ben Bowlin is the story of a cure that becomes its own disease. This is more than just a tale of Ozark vigilantes. It is a timeless warning about the desperate hunger for order and the terrible price that is sometimes paid to achieve it. It is the story of what happens when good, frightened men, abandoned by the law, decide to walk the razor's edge between justice and vengeance, only to lose their balance and fall into the abyss. The bald knobbers rose from the dirt to give their community hope, but their legacy is a stark reminder that a society's saviors can all too easily become its tyrants, and that a revolution born of righteousness will almost always end by eating its own. And so the story returns to the darkness, to a lonely road and the sound of a single horse. The ghost of Ben Bowlin isn't just a campfire tale meant to scare children. He is the restless spirit of this lesson. He is a permanent warning, etched into the very landscape, a silent testament to a brutal truth. In a land without law, the man who promises to save you from the monsters is often the first one to become a monster himself. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. I'm standing here in the town square of Manchester, Kentucky, looking at the Clay County Courthouse. On a quiet afternoon like this, it looks like any other seat of county government. But these bricks have seen more history and more blood than most battlefields. A Kentucky governor once called this place the bleeding wound of the state, and for over 50 years was the heart of that wound. Here, where all you hear now is the wind in the trees, the silence was once shattered by a war between families that turned the rule of law into a bitter joke. Today, we're going to listen to the whispers from this place and piece together the story of how it all began. To understand the explosion, you first have to see the powder keg. Let's go back to 1844. Manchester, Kentucky wasn't much more than a collection of log and clapboard buildings around a courthouse, set against the vast green wilderness of the Cumberland Mountains. Life here was hard, governed by the seasons and the unwritten laws of kinship. A man's word was his bond, and his honor was worth more than his life. In this world, some names carried more weight than others, and no name carried more weight than Garrard. They were the closest thing Clay County had to royalty. The family patriarch, Theophilus T. Garrard, was a powerful statesman, a name known all the way in the capital. His son Daniel moved through these dusty streets with an air of absolute confidence, the kind that comes from knowing your family's power is the ultimate law of the land. Then there was Dr. Abner Baker. He was a man of two worlds. On one hand, he was a physician, a man of education and science in a place where folk remedies were still king. But he was also a man of Clay County, born and bred. His hands were just as calloused by the code of these hills as any farmer's, and his pride ran just as deep. He was respected, but he wasn't a Garrard, and in Clay County, that distinction mattered. The flashpoint between these two men wasn't some mythical silver mine, as the legends now claim. It was something far more practical and far more valuable, the local saltpeter works. In the 1840s, saltpeter was the key ingredient in gunpowder. Controlling it meant controlling the means for every man to hunt, to defend his home, to be self-reliant. It was power, pure and simple, and both Baker and Garrard wanted control. For months, their business dispute was a low rumble of thunder in the distance. You could feel it in the air of Manchester. The sideways glances in the general store, the conversations that stopped when one of them entered a room. Two proud men, their ambitions circling each other like wolves. The people of the town went about their lives, but they were watching. They knew the code. They knew that in these mountains, a storm can roll in without warning, and everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the first crack of lightning. The stories passed down through generations are one thing, but sometimes you can find the cold, hard facts printed in black and white. Here, in the Clay County Historical Archives, I'm holding a digital copy of a newspaper clipping from a Lexington paper dated 1844. It's fragile, even as an image on a screen. The language is formal, a world away from our own. It describes the killing of Daniel Garrard not as a murder, but as an unfortunate and fatal affray. It speaks of the public shock and the immediate arrest of Dr. Abner Baker. But it's a small, almost overlooked detail in the third paragraph that truly matters. It mentions that Baker's defense team, some of the most expensive lawyers in the state, were preparing a novel argument, temporary insanity. This wasn't just a legal strategy. In a place like Clay County, where honor and accountability were everything, this was an insult. The idea that a man wasn't responsible for his actions, that he could kill the son of the most powerful man in the county and then hide behind a doctor's diagnosis, it was unthinkable. This piece of paper isn't just a news report. It's the official record of the moment the two sides stopped speaking the same language. One side started talking about the law, and the other was thinking only of justice. And that raised a critical question that would echo for decades. What happens when the law offers an escape, but the people demand a reckoning? That newspaper clipping only tells you what happened. It doesn't tell you how it felt on that hot, dusty day in Manchester. The argument between Dr. Baker and Daniel Garrard didn't start with a shout. It started as a low murmur in the middle of the street, two men standing toe to toe, the air crackling around them. The saltpeter works was the reason, but honor was the fuel. Voices rose with the heat of the day, and soon the whole town was watching from doorways and windows, silent witnesses to a prideful rage that was about to boil over. An insult was thrown. We'll never know the exact words, but in a place like this, a man's name is all he truly owns. Whatever was said, it was the point of no return. There was a flash of steel, a single deafening crack that echoed off the clapboard storefronts, and Daniel Garrard fell to the ground. The son of the most powerful family in the county lay dead in the dust. In that moment, Dr. Abner Baker wasn't a man of medicine. He was just another Clay County man who had answered a perceived slight with finality. The law moved swiftly at first. Baker was arrested, and for a moment it seemed like the system would work. A trial, a verdict, a hanging. That was the expected order of things. But then, a new word began to filter through the mountains, a word that felt like a trick from a faraway city. Insanity. The Baker family, with its money, had hired lawyers who claimed the doctor hadn't known what he was doing, that his mind had snapped. To the Garrards, and to half of Clay County, this was a second, deeper wound. It was a declaration that a rich man's law could wash away his blood. It was a cowardly trick, a way to cheat the hangman, and more importantly, a way to cheat the code of the mountains. They saw it not as a legal defense, but as a profound act of disrespect to the dead and a challenge to the living. The seeds of conflict had been sown the moment Garrard fell, but this legal maneuver was the dark, fertile soil they needed to grow. The Garrard clan and their allies gathered on their porches and in their cabins, not to wait for a verdict from a judge, but to plan a reckoning. The official court had its own schedule, but in the hollows of Clay County, a different, older court was now in session, and it recognized only one sentence: blood for blood. Official records and old newspapers can give you the skeleton of a story, but the soul of it, the part that still beats, lives in the people who carry the I drove down a winding road deep into Clay County to a small house with a porch swing that's probably seen 100 years of summers. I came here to speak with a woman named Mary, the great-great-grandniece of Daniel Garrard. She is in her 80s, with eyes as clear as a mountain spring, and she holds the family's version of the story not as history, but as a living truth. We sat on that porch for an hour, the chains of the swing groaning a slow rhythm, before I even asked about the feud. She knew why I was there. She told me stories of her childhood, of hard winters and loving parents. And then she looked out toward the hills. "You want to know why they couldn't let it be?" she said. It wasn't a question. "My granddaddy told me what his father told him," she began, her voice steady. "When the news came that the Bakers were trying to get Abner off by claiming he was insane, it was like Daniel had been killed all over again. It wasn't about the law anymore. It was about honor. To them, the Bakers were saying a Garrard's life was worth so little, you could take it and then just lie your way out of the consequences." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto mine. It wasn't just anger. It was a duty. They believed if they let Abner Baker live out his days after a stunt like that, the Garrard name would be a joke. Every man in the county would know that you could wrong them and get away with it. They felt they had no choice. The law had failed to give them justice, so the family had to. That single piece of family law, passed down through 5 generations, explains everything. It wasn't just an act of revenge they were planning. In their minds, it was an act of survival. Dr. Abner Baker was sent to the Eastern State Asylum in Lexington. To the outside world, this was the end of the matter. A killer, deemed insane, was safely locked away. But in the hollows of Clay County, it was seen as a temporary delay. The Garrards and their allies didn't see walls and doctors. They saw a debt that was still unpaid. They waited. Patience is a virtue carved into the people of these mountains, and they could wait for true justice as long as it took. For months, a tense, unnatural quiet settled over the county, the kind of stillness that comes before the deadliest of storms. Then, in 1845, the news came. It traveled by horseback and word of mouth, a spark landing in a field of dry tinder. Dr. Baker had escaped. He was coming home. To the Garrards, this was the ultimate act of defiance. The law had failed to punish him, and now it had failed to even contain him. He wasn't just a killer who had cheated justice. He was a ghost walking back into their lives, a living symbol of their family's dishonor. The time for waiting was over. There was no public call to arms. It happened quietly, with grim-faced men grabbing their long rifles from above the fireplace, nodding to their wives, and disappearing into the woods. This wasn't a mob. It was a posse, a self-appointed instrument of the only law they now recognized. They knew the trails, the creeks, and the hiding places better than any lawman from the city. They weren't hunting a fugitive. In their minds, they were escorting a man to the gallows that the state had been too cowardly to build. They found him. We don't know exactly where the ambush was laid, perhaps in a narrow hollow where the creek runs shallow, or along a ridge that offered a clear line of sight. But for Dr. Abner Baker, the journey home ended there. The deep silence of the Appalachian forest was shattered by a coordinated volley of rifle fire. It was swift, brutal, and final. There was no trial, no judge, no jury. Just the cold, hard arithmetic of the mountain code, a life for a life. This was the point of no return. The first killing had been a crime of passion, a dispute that ended in tragedy. This second killing was a calculated execution, a public statement written in gunpowder and blood. It was a declaration to all of Clay County and to the distant government in Frankfort that the official law had no authority here. The Garrards had reclaimed their family's honor, and in doing so, they had thrown down a gauntlet. Now, the Baker family and their allies had a blood debt of their own to repay. The feud was no longer a disagreement. It was an inheritance, and it would be passed down to the next generation with all its terrible weight. I'm back at the courthouse in Manchester, but this time, I'm looking closer. The afternoon sun is low, casting long shadows across the lawn. A building like this, over 100 years old, absorbs history. And if you run your hand along these old bricks, you're touching the last silent witness to the war's most violent chapter. This is the place where the feud stopped being a series of back-alley ambushes and became an open rebellion. They say if you look close enough at the stone pillars by the entrance, you can still find the chips and scars where bullets from a dozen different gunfights struck home. You have to imagine this lawn, not neatly trimmed, but churned to mud, filled with armed men loyal to the Howard clan. You have to picture those high windows, not with sunlight glinting off them, but barricaded from the inside with heavy oak desks and law books, with the glint of rifle barrels poking through the gaps. Because in 1898, this building wasn't a courthouse. It was a fortress, seized by Bad Tom Baker and his men. And right here, on this very lawn, the governor of Kentucky set up the state militia with a Gatling gun, a weapon of industrial warfare aimed at the heart of their own county seat. This is where it happened. The war came out of the shadows of the hollers and declared itself right here in the open. And on these very steps, years later, a final, fatal price would be paid. The feud didn't just smolder after the Civil War. It was forged into something harder, something colder. By the late 1890s, the fight was in the hands of a new generation, men who had grown up on stories of the first killings. On one side was Big Jim Howard, a man who could use a law book or a rifle with equal skill. On the other was the fearsome Bad Tom Baker, a one-armed Confederate veteran whose reputation was as hard as a coffin nail. The animosity between them finally reached its breaking point when Howard, using his political influence, began to stack the legal system against the Baker clan. Feeling the walls of the law closing in, Tom Baker made a decision that would stun the entire state. He would take the law itself hostage. In 1898, he and his heavily armed followers marched into Manchester, not as citizens, but as an occupying army. They stormed the courthouse, drove out the officials, and barricaded the doors. The seat of county justice was now the fortress of a clan warlord. From the second-story windows, the glint of rifle barrels sent a clear message to Jim Howard and his allies. The time for legal tricks was over. This would be settled with gunpowder. Manchester became a ghost town. Doors were bolted, windows shuttered. The only sounds were the scraping of boots on gravel and the sharp, ugly crack of a rifle shot that would echo through the empty streets, followed by an even more terrifying silence. A spider web of cracks would appear in a storefront window. A horse tied to a post would suddenly fall, its quiet death a warning to anyone who dared to show themselves. Inside the courthouse, the air was thick with tension and the smell of stale tobacco smoke. Tom Baker, his one arm as steady as iron, directed his men, their faces grim in the dusty shafts of light filtering through the barricades. The standoff dragged on for days. The news of a county courthouse under siege by its own citizens reached the governor's mansion in Frankfort. It was an embarrassment, an open sore on the face of Kentucky. Governor William O. Bradley declared Clay County to be in a state of insurrection. He called it the bleeding wound of the state, and he decided to cauterize it with force. The arrival of the state militia was a sight no one in Manchester would ever forget. Uniformed soldiers marching in formation, followed by a wagon carrying a weapon of modern war, a Gatling gun. They set it up on the courthouse lawn, its brass casings gleaming in the sun, its multiple barrels aimed squarely at the front doors. This was no longer a family feud. This was a rebellion. The government of Kentucky was prepared to mow down its own citizens to restore order. The air grew heavy, silent. Inside, the Baker clan looked out at the machine gun, a weapon that could tear through their wooden barricades like paper. Outside, the militia commander stared at the courthouse, knowing the order to fire would result in a slaughter. This was the heart of darkness, a moment when all pretense of civilization had vanished, leaving only two armed camps separated by 100 yards of lawn and 50 years of hate. The siege didn't end with the roar of the Gatling gun. It ended with a quiet, cold calculation. Tom Baker, for all his fury, was not a fool. He saw the inevitable. The doors to the courthouse eventually swung open, and the Baker clan walked out, laying down their weapons. But it wasn't a surrender. Their eyes, burning with defiance, promised that this was only a pause. The state had taken back its building, but the war for Clay County was far from over. The bleeding had been stopped for a moment, but the wound was now deeper than ever. After the soldiers and the Gatling gun went home, the war moved from the courthouse lawn back into the courthouse itself. The weapons were no longer rifles, but pieces of paper, and I'm looking at one of them right now. This is a copy of the official indictment brought against Bad Tom Baker and his men following the siege. The script is formal, the ink faded, the language cold and precise. It lists the charges in stark legal terms: armed insurrection, sedition, conspiracy to intimidate an officer of the law. On paper, it paints a simple picture of a band of outlaws who tried to overthrow the government. It's neat, it's clean, and it's a masterclass in how history is written by the winners. But reading this is like reading a doctor's report that lists the cause of death as cessation of heartbeat. It's technically true, but it tells you nothing of the disease that ravaged the body for years. This document has no lines for the 50 years of bad blood. It doesn't mention the political machinations of the Howard clan or the deep-seated belief that a Baker couldn't get a fair hearing in that very building. The paper simply lists the crime. It completely erases the reason. It reduces a multi-generational war down to a few sterile legal phrases, stripping away all the honor, the rage, and the grief that led those men to make their stand. And with this document, the full weight of the state's power was about to come crashing down on the Baker clan. With the Gatling gun gone and the militia back in their barracks, a different kind of army descended on Clay County. This one wore suits and carried leather briefcases filled with law books. The state of Kentucky was determined to make an example of Bad Tom Baker. This wouldn't be a local trial with a jury of neighbors. This was the full weight of the Commonwealth coming down on one man. The trial was a spectacle. The Manchester courthouse, the very building Tom Baker had held as a fortress, was now his cage. Every day, the courtroom was packed to the rafters, a silent, divided sea of humanity. On one side sat the friends and family of the Baker clan, their faces set like stone. On the other side sat the allies of Big Jim Howard, their expressions a mixture of triumph and anticipation. Howard himself was often there, a quiet, imposing figure in the back, watching the slow, methodical destruction of his great rival. You could feel the hate in the air, so thick you could choke on it. Tom Baker sat at the defendant's table, his one arm resting motionless. He was a lion in a cage, a creature of the open ridges and wild hollows, now trapped by legal arguments and procedural rules he neither understood nor respected. The state's prosecutors painted him as a traitor, a revolutionary who had spit in the face of the law. His defense argued he was a man pushed to the brink, a citizen who had only occupied the courthouse because he knew he could never get justice within its walls. An argument that was, in its own way, a damning confession that the system was broken. The jury listened, their faces pale. They were local men, and they knew that whatever verdict they delivered, they would have to live with the consequences. They were judging not just Tom Baker, but the future of Clay County. But the outcome was never really in doubt. The state had been humiliated, and someone had to pay. When the jury foreman stood to read the verdict, the room fell into a dead silence. The word guilty was spoken quietly, but it landed like a hammer blow. Tom Baker didn't flinch. He didn't rage or despair. He simply looked across the room, his gaze locking onto Jim Howard. In that one look, a lifetime of hatred was exchanged. The law had finally put Bad Tom Baker behind bars. But everyone in that room knew that a jail cell could hold the man, but it could never contain the feud. The law had won its battle, but in doing so, it had only ensured the war would continue. Up on a hill overlooking Manchester, there's a quiet cemetery where the wind rustles through the leaves of ancient oak trees. The tombstones are a library of endings, some new and polished, others old and leaning, their names almost erased by a century of rain and frost. This is where all the fury and ambition of the Clay County War finally came to rest. And this is where you find them. Over here is the grave of Bad Tom Baker. It's a simple military-style stone befitting a Confederate soldier. It lists his name, his company, and his dates. There are no grand pronouncements, just the hard, simple facts of a life that ended. His family still tends to it. A small flag flutters here on Memorial Days. It's a place of quiet, defiant dignity. And then, you walk just 100 yards or so past a few other families, and you find the marker for James Big Jim Howard. It's a bit more substantial, a testament to a man of property and political power. He lies here surrounded by his own kin. They lie so close now, these two great enemies. For decades they were the twin poles of a war that tore this county apart, and now they're silent neighbors in the same Kentucky soil. All that rage, all that blood, all that power, reduced to two names carved in granite, slowly fading under the Appalachian sun. Seeing them here, you'd think the story ended with Tom Baker's conviction. But a prison sentence wasn't the final chapter. The Mountain Code had one last bill to collect, and the story of how both these men ended up on this hill is the feud's last and most bitter reckoning. With Bad Tom Baker locked away in the Frankfort Penitentiary, a strange and fragile peace settled over Clay County. For the first time in decades, Big Jim Howard was the undisputed king. He had won. He had used the law, the militia, and the courts to do what generations of his family couldn't do with rifles. He had broken the power of the Baker clan. For a few years, it seemed the war was finally over, ended not with a bang, but with the clang of a prison gate. But the politics of Kentucky have always been a blood sport. In 1899, the state was ripped apart by the most violent and disputed gubernatorial election in its history. When the Democrat William Goebel was assassinated in Frankfort in 1900, the state teetered on the brink of its own civil war. A massive investigation was launched, and a net was cast for anyone with a reputation for political violence. And in one of history's cruelest twists, the master of the law, Big Jim Howard, found himself caught in its web. He was accused of being a conspirator in the plot to kill the governor. The trial was a statewide sensation. Jim Howard, the man who had so skillfully used the courts against Tom Baker, now faced a jury with his own life on the line. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The great victor of the Clay County War was now a prisoner himself. And then, the feud delivered its final, bitter irony. The same political chaos that had condemned Jim Howard miraculously set his old enemy free. The new governor, in a flurry of politically motivated pardons, granted clemency to many men, including the aging, one-armed insurrectionist from Clay County. Bad Tom Baker walked out of prison a free man. So, by 1901, the chessboard had been reset for one final terrible move. Jim Howard, through his own powerful connections, soon secured a pardon as well. Both old lions were back in the same territory. Baker was now an old man, perhaps believing the feud had died with their mutual imprisonment. Howard was also old, but he was a man who had been publicly shamed and imprisoned, and he had one last debt to settle. The long shadow of the feud had stretched across 57 years, and it was about to fall one last time, right back where it all began, in the streets of Manchester. Even now, more than a century after the last shot was fired, the Clay County War isn't a settled matter here. It isn't just a chapter in a history book. It's a living memory, a story that gets told on front porches and at family reunions. And the version you hear depends entirely on which family is telling it. The names Baker and Howard don't just belong to the dead. They belong to the living, and they still carry the weight of that old, bitter argument. To this day, if you talk to folks whose ancestors stood with Tom Baker, you'll hear the story of a hero. They'll tell you, Bad Tom was a man of the people, a proud Confederate soldier who stood up to a corrupt political machine run by the wealthy and powerful Howard family. They'll say the courthouse siege wasn't insurrection. It was a desperate man's only way to demand a justice he could never get from a bought and paid for judge. In their version, Tom Baker was a man of honor who was assassinated in cold blood, a victim of a coward's bullet because his enemies could never face him in a fair fight. But then, you drive a few miles down the road and ask a family whose great-grandfather rode with Jim Howard, and you'll get a different truth entirely. They'll tell you Big Jim Howard was the law. He was a sheriff, a leader, a man trying to drag a wild and violent county into the modern age. To them, Bad Tom Baker was a ruthless outlaw, a violent thug who thought he was above the law and terrorized anyone who stood against him. The courthouse siege was an act of treason, an attack on civilization itself. And his death on the courthouse steps. That wasn't an assassination. It was an execution, the long overdue end for a man who had lived by the gun. So which one is the truth? Was Tom Baker a folk hero or a homegrown terrorist? Was Jim Howard a civic leader or a political boss who used the law like a club? The honest answer is that after 100 years, the truth is a matter of blood and memory. The facts are a pile of dry bones, and it's the families that put the flesh and spirit back on them. The war is over, but the argument about who was right, who was wrong, and who deserved what they got, that argument will probably never end. When the shooting finally stops and the last of the warlords are in the ground, a story enters a new phase of its life. The hard, jagged facts of who did what to whom begin to get smoothed over by time, like a stone in a fast-running creek. History becomes folklore. The Clay County War was too big, too bloody, and too long for people to simply file away. They had to make sense of it, to turn the sheer, brutal chaos into a lesson, or a warning, or a ghost. Ask around Manchester today, especially among the older folks, and you might hear a story told in a hushed voice on a dark autumn night. They say that if you stand near the courthouse when the streets are empty and quiet, you can sometimes see a shadow moving on the steps where Bad Tom Baker fell. A tall, lonely figure with one empty sleeve that seems to sway in a breeze that no one else can feel. They say he's still waiting, still looking for the man who shot him, or perhaps for a kind of justice he never found inside that building. It's more than just a ghost story. The feud lives on as a cautionary tale, a lesson that became woven into the fabric of the community. It's the story a father would tell a hot-headed son to warn him about the poison of carrying a grudge. Remember the Bakers and the Howards, he'd say. They fought for so long, they forgot what they were even fighting about, and all they earned was a piece of land on Cemetery Hill. The war became a local proverb, a dark piece of wisdom paid for with generations of blood. This is how a community processes a trauma this deep. The specific details of the legal disputes and the political maneuvers fade away. What remains is a powerful myth, a story of two families locked in a death spiral, a one-armed ghost who haunts the seat of justice, and a bloody warning that echoes down through the years. The facts belong to the archives, but the legend belongs to the mountains. So here I am again, back on the square in Manchester, looking at the same courthouse as the day begins to fade. But I'm not seeing it the same way. It's no longer just an old brick building. I can almost see the shadow of Daniel Garrard falling in the dust, feel the tension of the siege with Tom Baker's men peering from the windows, and hear the echo of that final fatal shot on these very steps. We came here to listen to the whispers of this place, and what we heard was a 57-year-long scream. The Clay County War is a story about how honor, when it turns to pride, can become a prison. It's about how revenge can become a family's only inheritance. It's a hard lesson, written in blood, that shows how easily the law can be broken and how much harder it is to put back together. It proves that the most dangerous place on earth can be the few miles between your neighbor's house and your own when a grudge is on the line. The next time you pass a quiet courthouse on a sleepy town square, remember this one. Remember what these bricks have seen and the price that was paid right here. The men are gone. The guns are silent. The bleeding wound has finally scarred over, but the story remains. Imagine this. An old woman sits on her porch in the misty mountains, her voice thin but clear. The tune she sings is simple, almost a lullaby. But the words tell of a jealous lover, a flash of steel, and a shallow grave by the river. This isn't just a song, it's a coroner's report. It's a witness statement from a ghost. Now imagine realizing that the hills around you are filled with these musical affidavits, detailing every kind of human tragedy imaginable. What if the darkest secrets of a region weren't written in dusty court records, but were hidden in plain sight, carried on a mournful melody? And who was the strange, suit-wearing lawyer who dared to venture into those isolated hollows to collect them? Today, we follow the man who became a detective of the past, using a banjo instead of a magnifying glass to uncover the bloody sagas the mountains tried to forget. Before we follow the man in the suit, we must first understand the world he was trying to save. In the early 1900s, the Appalachian Mountains were a nation unto themselves, a place where time flowed like creek water, slowly and in its own channel. The true victims of this story weren't just the people in the ballads. It was the memory of them, a living history held together by the frailest of threads, the human voice. This was a world built on self-reliance, where your closest neighbor might be a 2-hour walk over a ridge, and the law was often a distant, abstract idea. The keepers of these stories were not scholars or poets. They were farmers whose hands were stained with the same soil that would one day cover them. They were mothers who sang murder ballads to their children like lullabies, not to frighten them, but to teach them about the very real dangers of the world. Their lives were a cycle of hardship and small joys, marked by the seasons, the birth of a child, or the death of a neighbor. Their dreams were not of fame or fortune, but of a good harvest, healthy livestock, and a winter with enough firewood to keep the cold at bay. The mountains themselves were a living character in every story. They were a fortress that protected this unique culture, but also a prison that bred isolation and suspicion. A foggy hollow could hide a moonshine still, a family feud, or a fresh grave with equal ease. The deep woods and winding trails that were a source of life and sustenance could also swallow a person whole, leaving behind nothing but a whispered story. Justice here was often personal, and consequences were swift and final. These ballads, then, were more than just entertainment for long winter nights. They were the community's collective memory, its legal code, and its moral compass. A song about a betrayed lover was a stark warning. A ballad recounting a feud served as a map of bad blood, reminding each new generation who their friends were and who they could never trust. To lose these songs would be like a town losing its courthouse records, its newspaper archives, and its gravestones all at once. But even in this isolated world, shadows were beginning to gather. The first crackle of the radio was starting to echo through the hollows, bringing with it new songs from faraway cities. Young folks were hearing tales of a different life, a world of electricity and automobiles, and some were beginning to see the old ways as a burden. An entire library of ghosts, a complete history of human passion, violence, and sorrow, was at risk of fading into an unspoken silence, and only a very few seemed to notice. When Bascom Lamar Lunsford arrived in a remote holler, he was stepping into a unique kind of crime scene, one where the evidence was not bloodstains or broken furniture, but fading memories and fractured melodies. The first sign that something was wrong was often the silence. He would visit a family known for its music, only to find the younger generation knew the latest radio hit, but not the half-forgotten ballad their own grandfather used to sing about a local tragedy. The air was thick with an unnatural quiet, the sound of a culture slowly losing its voice. The clues he found were scattered and cryptic. In one cabin, he might collect a single haunting verse of the Omi Wise saga, a piece of the story preserved like a shard of bone. Miles away, over another ridge, he might hear the same melody, but attached to a different set of words, the names changed to protect a long-dead ancestor. He would find specific, tangible details embedded in the lyrics, the mention of the Yadkin River, or a landmark like Adam's Falls, clues that felt as real and specific as a footprint left at the scene of a crime. These weren't just random stories, they were anchored to the very soil beneath his feet. Yet this evidence only deepened the mystery. The scene spoke of chaos and the ravages of time. For every fact a song seemed to preserve, it offered 10 contradictions. Was Tom Dula a heartless killer, or a handsome fool manipulated by a jealous woman? The ballads Lunsford collected painted him as both, sometimes in the very same version. The trail of truth was overgrown with decades of gossip, family pride, and the simple, inevitable erosion of memory. The mountains held the secrets, but they offered no easy answers. Lunsford quickly realized his task was far more complex than simple recording. He was an archaeologist of sorrow, trying to reconstruct a complete skeleton from a handful of scattered, mismatched bones. Every person he spoke to was a witness, but their testimony was shaped by who told them the story and why. The wilderness he was navigating wasn't just the dense laurel thickets and steep ravines of the Blue Ridge, but the tangled, treacherous landscape of human memory itself, and it was filled with a multitude of unsettling questions. The first and most powerful suspect in the slow murder of these mountain sagas was the community itself. Lunsford quickly discovered that the greatest threat to a story was often the pain it carried. These weren't tales of distant kings and queens, they were raw, open wounds in the local memory. To sing about a young woman drowned in a river was to remember the real girl whose family still lived just down the creek. The songs were a constant reminder of a neighbor's betrayal, an ancestor's shame, or a violence that had torn families apart. Forgetting was not an accident. It was a choice, a form of self-preservation. The motive was a deep and understandable desire to bury the past. Many families felt a personal vendetta against the very history that defined them. As the 20th century progressed, the outside world began to cast a long shadow, bringing with it a condescending judgment of Appalachian life. The stereotype of the violent, feuding hillbilly was taking root, and these murder ballads felt like Exhibit A. To the younger generation especially, these songs were not a proud heritage, but a source of shame, a link to a brutal past they were desperate to escape. They wanted radios and cars, not grim reminders of the bad old days. The evidence of this quiet conspiracy was everywhere Lunsford looked. He'd approach an old man known to be a master fiddler and ask about a specific feud ballad, only to be met with a stony silence and the curt reply, "We don't trouble with that one no more." Parents actively stopped teaching the darkest songs to their children, preferring to pass on church hymns or the cheerful, impersonal tunes coming over the airwaves. This wasn't just forgetfulness, it was a deliberate act of cultural pruning, cutting away the painful branches of their own family trees. The community was turning on its own memories, hoping that silence would finally bring peace to the ghosts that haunted their hollows. If shame was driving the old songs into the shadows, a more seductive threat was beginning to change them in the open. The second suspect was someone no one wanted to point a finger at, the most gifted and ambitious musicians themselves. These were the keepers of the flame, the high priests of the tradition, the very people Lunsford sought out as his most valuable sources. Their betrayal wasn't one of malice, but of temptation, a quiet corruption that came from within the circle of trust. The secret motive was the dazzling promise of the modern world, delivered on a spinning shellac disc. In the 1920s, talent scouts from record labels like Victor and OK began venturing into the mountains. They weren't looking for historical documents, they were hunting for hits. They offered cash money, a life-changing sum for a family living on the edge of poverty, for a 3-minute recording. Suddenly, a song wasn't just a piece of heritage. It was a potential ticket to a life beyond the cornfield and the coal mine. A musician who had only ever played for neighbors at a barn dance was now being offered a small taste of immortality. Lunsford began to see the evidence of this pact everywhere. A long, grim ballad he had collected in its pure form from an elderly woman would reappear on a commercial record, but it would be different. The 15-verse saga of a bloody feud, with all its specific names and local details, was trimmed to a tidy 3 minutes. The killer's chilling, remorseless confession was replaced with a more palatable, moralizing chorus. The very soul of the story, its raw, uncomfortable truth, was being sanitized for sale. The custodians of the culture, in their understandable desire for a better life, were becoming agents of its alteration, polishing the jagged edges off the evidence until it no longer told the whole story. But the most dangerous intruder didn't carry a gun or a land deed. It arrived in a polished wooden box and spoke with 1,000 voices from a world away. The third suspect was a vast, impersonal, and relentless force, the rise of national mass media spearheaded by the radio. This was an entity with no face and no name, an invisible invader that could slip through the cracks of the tightest-knit community and whisper its promises directly into the heart of the home. Its motive was not malicious. It was something far more powerful: commerce. The radio wasn't interested in preserving the grim history of a specific mountain county. Its purpose was to create a single, unified American culture, one that bought the same soap, drove the same cars, and listened to the same songs. The old ballads, with their dark themes, rough edges, and hyper-local references, were an obstacle to this new, streamlined world. They were static in the signal of progress, a relic that didn't fit into a tidy, half-hour sponsored program. The presence of this threat created a quiet, creeping sense of cultural anxiety. The ancient art of storytelling, of passing a song from one generation to the next on a cold winter's night, was suddenly in competition with professional comedians and crooners from Nashville and New York. The local fiddler, a hero in his community for decades, now sounded amateurish compared to the polished bands broadcasting from the Grand Ole Opry. This external force didn't need to threaten or intimidate. Its very existence was a judgment. It carried an air of quiet menace, not with violence, but with the subtle, corrosive suggestion that the old ways were no longer good enough. In the beginning, Bascom Lamar Lunsford approached his collection like the lawyer he was, with a methodical belief that for every crime there was a single, definitive truth. He ventured into the mountains not just as a collector, but as an investigator, certain that he could track down the one pure version of each ballad, the original testimony that had been passed down unaltered through the generations. He believed that somewhere, in the most remote cabin, held in the memory of the oldest living soul, was the definitive, uncorrupted story of what truly happened to Laura Foster. He pursued this phantom through the rugged wilderness of human memory. He would meticulously record what he believed was the final word on the Tom Dula saga from a farmer in Wilkes County, only to travel 20 miles over the next ridge and hear a contradictory version from the man's own cousin. One song painted Tom as a romantic fool, another as a heartless killer. Ann Melton was a jealous accomplice in one holler and an innocent victim of rumor in the next. Every promising lead, every witness who claimed to have the real story from their great-grandmother, only led to another dead end, another fork in the trail. The single solid truth he sought was a red herring. He also assumed that the most celebrated local musicians, the prize-winning fiddlers and banjo pickers, would be the most reliable keepers of the ancient songs. He followed the sound of their music to barn dances and town squares, hoping to find the mother lode. But this trail, too, quickly went cold. He discovered that these were often the very people who had already been compromised. They were the first to be tempted by the record companies, the quickest to alter a 15-verse ballad into a catchy 3-minute tune. Their brilliant playing was often a cover for a story that had been stripped of its soul. The frustration for Lunsford must have been immense. The logical, orderly processes that worked in a courtroom were useless here. The evidence was alive, constantly changing with every telling. His investigation was yielding not clarity, but a growing, maddening fog. In the communities, his relentless probing questions began to stir a quiet unease. The fear was growing that perhaps these stories were not meant to be solved. Perhaps in trying to untangle the truth, This man from the outside world was simply pulling apart the last fragile threads holding their entire history together. As Bascom Lamar Lunsford pushed deeper into the mountains, the friendly smiles and offered dippers of water remained, but a new barrier rose to meet him, one as real as a stone wall, yet completely invisible. He was running into the unspoken law of the hills, a code of silence as old as the feuds themselves. The moment he moved beyond pleasantries and asked for a specific bloody ballad by name, the air on the porch would grow still. Eyes would drop. The answer was almost always the same: a slow shake of the head and a quiet mumble of "don't rightly recall that one," or the even more final, "we let that story die with the old folks." The reasons for this omerta were buried deep in the soil of the community. These songs were not abstract folklore, they were active social documents. To sing the ballad of the Allen Griffin feud in front of an Allen was more than rude. It was a hostile act, a dredging up of bad blood that generations had worked to bury. The names in the verses were not characters in a fable, they were the names on the weathered tombstones in the churchyard just up the hill. Lunsford quickly learned he wasn't just asking for a song. He was asking a man to testify against his neighbor's great-grandfather, and that was a line no one was willing to cross for a stranger. There was also a deep and abiding suspicion of any outsider asking too many questions. Who was this man in a starched collar, writing down their tragedies in his little notebook? The mountains had a long memory of being exploited by timber companies, by coal barons, and by condescending writers who came to caricature their way of life. Was Lunsford any different? Was he a cultural undertaker, come to put their most painful memories on display for a gawking world that already saw them as little more than violent savages? The silence was a shield, a way of protecting what little they had left that was truly their own. The psychological toll on the few who considered breaking this code was immense. One old woman, who knew a version of a local murder ballad that Lunsford had been searching for years, would only agree to sing it for him in her spring house, with the door bolted and the sound of the running water masking her voice. She was terrified, not of physical harm, but of something worse: the judgment of her neighbors, the quiet shunning that would follow if they knew she had given away their ghosts. In these hills, a reputation was all a person had, and the price for breaking the wall of silence was to lose it forever. For months, perhaps years, Bascom Lamar Lunsford operated as a detective chasing a ghost. He was searching for a single, verifiable truth, a definitive version of each ballad that could be entered into the record as historical fact. But the mountains resisted. The contradictions piled up, the silence grew deeper, and the logical mind of the lawyer was nearing a point of despair. He had a collection of beautiful broken fragments, but the complete, unassailable story he sought remained as elusive as smoke. The trail, it seemed, had finally gone cold. The turning point came not with a dramatic deathbed confession, but in a moment of quiet frustration. He was sitting on a porch with an elderly woman, trying once again to coax from her the full version of a local feud ballad. She would sing the beginning, her voice strong and sure, but when it came to the verses describing the killing, she would stop, shake her head, and hum a different tune, a simple, mournful church hymn. Lunsford, seeing another day's work dissolving into another dead end, was about to pack his things. But then he stopped, and he listened. He truly listened, not to the words, but to the feeling behind them. In the sorrowful cadence of that hymn, he suddenly heard the echo of the murder ballad. The forgotten clue wasn't a hidden lyric or a secret name. It was the realization that the emotion was the one thing that had survived intact. The community might change the names, forget the details, or refuse to speak the violence, but they never forgot the grief. The hymn was their way of telling the story when the story itself became too terrible to tell. It was the emotional core, the untainted piece of evidence he had been overlooking this whole time. This moment changed everything. It was as if a key had turned in a lock he didn't even know was there. He realized his entire approach had been wrong. He was not a detective hunting for a single culprit or a single truth. He was an archivist of human heartbreak. The contradictions and variations weren't flaws in the evidence. They were the evidence. They showed how a community grappled with, processed, and tried to heal from a trauma over generations. A renewed urgency surged through him. He had to collect it all, every fractured verse, every sanitized radio version, every mournful hymn that carried the ghost of the original tragedy. The real story wasn't in any single song. It was in the sum of all of them. With this new understanding, Bascom Lamar Lunsford stood like a prosecutor ready to deliver his closing argument. But in the spectral courtroom of his mind, the witness stand was empty, and the jury box was filled with ghosts. He had spent years searching for a single villain responsible for the slow death of the mountain sagas. He had cross-examined shame, ambition, and the relentless march of progress. And now, as he pieced together the fragments of evidence, the half-remembered verses, the sanitized records, the telling silences, the horrifying truth finally took shape. There was no single culprit. It was a conspiracy. He finally saw the first conspirator for what it was, the community's own shame. This was the inside man, the accomplice who unlocked the door and let the other forces in. The raw, bloody memories of the ballads had become a burden, a mark of otherness in a world that was rapidly modernizing. By choosing to bury their most painful stories, by refusing to teach their children the songs of feud and betrayal, the mountain folk had, with the best intentions, created a vacuum. They had disarmed their own culture, leaving it vulnerable and defenseless against the coming storm. Into this vacuum stepped the second conspirator, the gifted local musician, tempted by the promise of a world beyond the mountains. These were not villains, but tragic figures caught between two worlds. Driven by the understandable human desire for a few dollars and a little recognition, they became the unwitting agents of the crime. They took the raw, unvarnished testimony of the old songs and polished it for public consumption. They cut out the darkest verses, smoothed over the rough language, and sold a palatable, commercialized ghost of the real thing. They were the ones who put the forged signature on a false confession. And finally, Lunsford saw the mastermind, the cold, impersonal force that had orchestrated the entire affair, the radio and the rise of a national commercial culture. This was the entity that provided the motive, the means, and the opportunity. It offered a shiny, new, and effortless form of entertainment that made the old ways seem obsolete. It whispered the promise of a unified America where everyone listened to the same songs and shared the same simple stories. It created the very shame that had weakened the community's resolve and offered the very temptation that had turned its own guardians against it. In the end, Lunsford's discovery was far more chilling than a single, identifiable villain. The true culprit was an unholy trinity, a perfect and terrible collaboration between the past, the present, and the future. The motive wasn't malice, but something far more powerful, the inevitable crushing weight of change. The ancient, isolated world of the mountains, with its dark memories and bloody sagas, had been put on trial by the 20th century. And in this trial, there could only be one verdict. The old world was found guilty of being old, and the sentence was death by forgetting. Now that we have identified the culprits, we can finally reconstruct the crime. This was not a murder committed in a dark alley with a single sudden blow. It was a slow poisoning carried out in the warm, fire-lit cabins of the mountains themselves, with the victims' own families as unknowing accomplices. The truth, my friends, is that the ballads were not killed. They were allowed to die. Imagine an old man, a patriarch, sitting on his porch with his grandson as the evening shadows stretch across the hollow. He clears his throat to sing the old ballad, the one about the land dispute that cost his own great-uncle his life. He begins the first verse, his voice a familiar, comforting rasp. But then he looks at the boy, who is wearing a store-bought shirt and whose mind is full of things like automobiles and the world beyond the ridge. and the old man's voice falters. The next words, the ones about the gunshot and the bitter feud, freeze in his throat. In that moment of silence, a story that had survived for a century suffers a mortal wound. It doesn't end with a scream, but with a quiet, heartbreaking stillness. Now picture a different scene, a few years later. A talented young fiddler, the pride of his county, sits stiffly in front of a strange, cone-shaped microphone in a makeshift studio in a Bristol hotel room. A man in a suit tells him he has 3 minutes. He begins to sing the saga of Omi Wise, but when he gets to the part where the villain pleads with her, he softens the words. He changes a raw, brutal line into a more poetic, romantic one. The man in the suit nods in approval, and with that single, simple change, the soul of the song begins to bleed out, replaced by something cleaner, safer, and no longer entirely true. The final blow came not from a person, but from a piece of furniture. See it in your mind's eye, a family gathered in their cabin after supper. For generations, this was the time for stories, for the banjo to be taken down from its peg. But now, in the corner, sits a handsome wooden box with a glowing dial, a single cyclops eye staring into the room. They turn a knob, and a clear voice from Nashville fills the cabin with a song about a love they've never known and a city they've never seen. They are captivated. And over in the shadows, the banjo hangs on the wall, untouched. Its strings are not broken, they are simply silent. This is how the great bloody sagas of the mountains met their end. There was no single gunshot, no grand battle. It was 1,000 tiny, quiet surrenders. A forgotten verse here, a changed lyric there, an evening spent listening to the radio instead of a grandfather's voice. The stories became ghosts in their own homes, fading slowly until only a faint, melodic echo remained. They weren't murdered in a fit of passion. They were simply starved, one by one, in the quiet, comfortable darkness of a new and brighter world. There was no grand courtroom for this crime, no judge in black robes. The trial of the mountain ballads was held in the court of progress, and the jury was the American people, whose ears were already filled with the siren song of a new century. The prosecution, a slick and powerful attorney called the Future, presented its case with devastating force. It showed evidence of a faster, brighter, more connected world, a world of convenience and prosperity that made the old ways seem slow, dark, and obsolete. The defense was barely heard, a few faint, mournful notes from an old fiddle, drowned out by the confident roar of the radio. The accused parties reacted to the proceedings in their own ways. The commercial media, the mastermind, showed no remorse. A force of nature doesn't apologize for the storm. The ambitious musicians who had altered the songs for profit took the stand with a mix of defiance and quiet regret, arguing they had simply made a deal to survive in a world that was leaving them behind. And the community itself, the accomplice, sat in silent acceptance of its fate. They had already bought the radios and listened to the new songs. They had, in effect, already pled guilty. The verdict was swift and nearly unanimous. The ancient, bloody sagas of the mountains were found guilty on all counts, guilty of being too complex, too sorrowful, and too stubbornly local for a modern, optimistic nation. The sentence was not execution, but something far more final: obsolescence. They were to be banished from the front porch and the public square, remanded to the custody of a few dusty archives and forgotten collections, their stories replaced by a simpler, more cheerful narrative that sold more records. This verdict was, at the time, overwhelmingly popular. It was called Progress, Enlightenment, the inevitable march of history. But in this vast, impersonal courtroom, there was one man who refused to accept the judgment. Bascom Lamar Lunsford did not act as a lawyer for the defense. It was far too late for that. Instead, he appointed himself the court clerk for the condemned. He worked tirelessly, not to overturn the verdict, but to create a perfect, unassailable transcript of the proceedings. He recorded every last piece of evidence, every haunting testimony, not for this trial, but for an appeal to a higher court, the court of history. And so, while the world celebrated a victory, Lunsford preserved the memory of what was lost. He ensured that the case of the mountain ballads would never truly be closed. He created a file so thick with sorrow and beauty that future generations would be forced to reopen it, to re-examine the evidence and ask themselves a chilling question. Was this justice, or was it a crime? It's a verdict that, thanks to him, still sparks arguments in these hills to this day. The verdict had been handed down, and the consequences rippled through the mountains for generations, changing the fate of everyone involved. The survivors of this cultural crime, the ballads themselves, were now safe, but forever altered. Rescued by Lunsford, they were no longer living, breathing stories shared on a porch. They became ghosts in a filing cabinet, their voices captured on wax cylinders and stored in the climate-controlled vaults of the Library of Congress. They were saved from extinction, but at the cost of their freedom. They had become specimens, butterflies pinned under glass, their beautiful, tragic patterns preserved, but their flight forever ended. For the community, the people of the mountains, the verdict of obsolete had a devastating, long-term effect. The silence that Lunsford had encountered became the new normal. A generation grew up disconnected from the bloody sagas that had once defined their ancestors' world. The caricature of the simple, banjo-strumming hillbilly, once a condescending fiction, began to feel like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Many of the brightest young people, convinced that their heritage was a source of shame, left the mountains for the cities, leaving behind an aging population and a profound sense of cultural amnesia. They had been judged by the outside world, and in their hearts, many felt their own culture had been found wanting. The descendants of the guilty parties, meanwhile, thrived in ways no one could have predicted. The ambitious musicians who had sanitized the old songs for commercial appeal became the founding fathers of a global phenomenon. The DNA of their altered ballads, the simple chords, the narrative style, the themes of love and loss, mutated and evolved, becoming the bedrock of what the world would come to know as country music. In a bitter twist of fate, the very act of betrayal ensured a kind of immortality. The raw, uncomfortable truth of the mountains was gone, but its polished, commercially viable ghost now echoed from every radio in the nation. And so, the lives of everyone in those mountains were forever changed. A people who had once known exactly who they were, their identity rooted in a deep and often dark well of shared stories, were now set adrift. They inherited the accent, the family names, and the stunning, unforgiving landscape, but they had lost the lyrical map that explained what it all meant. They became haunted not by the ghosts of the old stories, but by the far more unsettling ghost of their absence. You might think the story ends there, in a dusty archive, with the final verdict rendered by a changing world. But if you know where to look, you can still find the evidence of Bascom Lamar Lunsford's investigation scattered all across these hills. The traces of his work have not vanished. They have simply sunk into the soil, becoming part of the landscape itself. The most tangible remnant of his crusade is the Mountain Dance and Folk Festival, which he founded in Asheville in 1928. It still happens every year. On a warm summer night, you can go there and see the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the very people he interviewed. You can see them playing the same banjos, dancing the same steps, and most importantly, singing the same songs. It is a living, breathing wake, a place where the ghosts Lunsford collected are brought out into the light, not to be mourned, but to be celebrated. It is his final, defiant piece of evidence, presented to a new jury year after year. The songs themselves are another echo. Thanks to the collection he so painstakingly assembled, the ballads did not die. They were rediscovered. The raw, haunting melodies he saved from oblivion became a wellspring for the American folk revival of the 1950s and 60s. When a modern artist stands on a stage in New York or London and sings the chilling tale of Tom Doola, they are, whether they know it or not, calling on one of Lunsford's ghosts. His work ensured that these hyper-local tragedies became part of a universal human story. And the story of Lunsford himself has become a piece of Appalachian folklore. The whispers about the minstrel lawyer still linger. He is remembered not just as a collector, but as a mythical figure, a man who walked between worlds and knew the mountain's darkest secrets. The legend of the man who knew where the bodies were buried has outlived almost everyone who told it, a testament to the power of a man who listened so intently that he became part of the story he was trying to save. But the most powerful echo is in the land itself. The rivers where lovers were betrayed still flow. The sharp ridges that once divided warring families still cut across the sky. These places hold the memory of what happened there, etched into the very rock and soil. Bascom Lamar Lunsford's greatest achievement was not that he saved the songs, but that he saved the connection between the songs and the land. And now, when you hear one of those old ballads, it feels as if the mountain itself is singing, telling you its own dark and beautiful secrets. So we return to the question we asked at the beginning, around our digital campfire. What if a region's darkest secrets were carried not in books, but on a melody? We now have our answer. The secrets were a community's soul, its open wounds, its moral code, and its cautionary tales. And the strange man in the suit who collected them was more than a folklorist. He was a custodian of ghosts. Bascom Lamar Lunsford understood that these weren't just songs. They were the last, fading testimony of a world on trial, and he was the only lawyer willing to take the case. This is a story, then, not just of a man saving songs, but of the immense, often brutal price of progress. It is a timeless lesson on the seduction of forgetting. It teaches us that the most dangerous threat to a culture is rarely an invading army, but more often a quiet, internal whisper that tells us our own complicated, painful history is a burden we should lay down in favor of a simpler, brighter future. Lunsford's great crusade was a fight against this seductive silence, an argument that our scars are not meant to be hidden. They are proof that we have lived, and they are warnings that must never, ever be forgotten. Bascom Lamar Lunsford fought a war against the quiet death of memory, and in the end, he did not win. No one could. But he achieved something far more important. He ensured that the ghosts of Appalachia would never be homeless. He gave them a permanent refuge in the archives of a nation, and a voice that could still be heard by anyone willing to listen. And now, my friends, the story is yours to keep. The next time you hear an old, mournful tune carried on the wind, listen closely. It might not be the wind at all, but a story that, thanks to one stubborn man, refused to stay silent. For 3 days in the summer of 1889, the town of Hazard, Kentucky, was a war zone. The courthouse wasn't a place of law, but a brick fortress under siege. An army of nearly 100 men, led by a hired killer known only as Bad Tom Smith, had come to take the town by force, and the streets echoed with the constant crack of Winchester rifles. The newspapers called it the bloody end of a clan feud over money and power. But the old-timers in these mountains knew the truth was deeper, rooted in honor, betrayal, and a code of justice written in blood. Today, we're going to separate the gun smoke from the legend. We'll find out how a political dispute exploded into open warfare, and how one man's death on the gallows marked the end of an entire era in Appalachia. Before the bullets flew, Hazard, Kentucky, was a world unto itself, nestled deep in the rugged heart of Perry County. This wasn't a peaceful mountain hollow, it was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The hills were rich with timber and the black promise of coal, and the man who controlled the town controlled that wealth. Here, power wasn't held by a mayor in a starched collar. Power was the sheriff who was your kin, the judge who owed you a favor, and a rifle that never missed its mark. The air was thick with the tension of a storm that had been gathering for years. On one side stood the French clan. They were the old guard of Appalachia, people whose roots ran as deep as the ancient oaks. They lived and breathed the unwritten laws of the mountains. Honor was more valuable than gold. An insult to your family was an act of war, and you settled your debts yourself, blood for blood. Led by Joseph C. French, they saw Perry County as their birthright, a sacred trust passed down through generations. To them, the coming of new laws and outside money felt like an invasion. Challenging them were the Eversoles and their powerful allies, the Combs family. They were the new force, more ambitious, more connected to the changing world beyond the mountains. Their unofficial leader, Josiah Combs, was a shrewd politician who saw a future paved with railroads and fueled by coal money. They believed the old ways of the French clan were holding the county back. They wanted to bring in progress, even if it meant tearing down the old world to build their new one. There was no middle ground in Hazard. You were either with the French or you were with the Eversoles. Every election for sheriff became an armed standoff. Every court case was a test of loyalty. The town was split down the middle, a simmering cauldron of suspicion and whispered threats. You chose your side, and you prayed it was the winning one. The official story says their feud was born of politics and greed, a fight for control of the county's resources. But the mountains remember things the official records leave out. Old folks still whisper the other stories around the fire. Some say it all started when an Eversole man publicly shamed a woman from the French family, an unforgivable sin. Others talk of a high-stakes poker game where a deed to a valuable piece of land was lost on a crooked hand, and the argument that followed was settled with a pistol. Whatever the first spark was, it no longer mattered. A decade of bad blood, of small ambushes on lonely roads and threats exchanged on the courthouse steps, had turned the simmer into a rolling boil. These two families, these two visions of Appalachia, were on a collision course, and they were about to drag the entire town of Hazard into a war from which no one would walk away clean. The simmering feud had reached a stalemate of blood and fear. Ambushes on lonely roads and threats in crowded saloons were getting them nowhere. The French clan, feeling the pressure, realized that the old ways of fighting weren't enough. The Eversoles, with their political connections, were chipping away at their power. To win, they needed more than just loyal kinsmen. They needed a weapon, a human weapon who knew neither fear nor pity. And so, they sent out the call. They found him in the dark corners of the mountains, a man whose name was already a legend, whispered with a shudder, Tom Smith. But no one called him Tom. He was Bad Tom Smith. He wasn't a French by blood. He was a mercenary, a regulator they called them back then, an angel of death with a Winchester rifle. They said he was tall, silent, with eyes as cold and grey as a winter river. The stories claimed he killed his first man at 16 and could shoot the eye out of a squirrel in a thunderstorm. He wasn't just a gunman, he was a force of nature. The French clan didn't just hire him, they unleashed him. With the arrival of Bad Tom Smith, the war for Hazard changed. The scattered violence stopped. In its place began a systematic campaign of terror. Smith became the marshal of the French clan, their chief enforcer, and he brought a cold, calculated brutality to the conflict. Their primary target was the heart of the Eversole power structure, Sheriff Joe Eversole and his deputies. The feud was no longer about honor, it was about extermination. The final line was crossed on a quiet evening, a moment that would be seared into the memory of Perry County forever. Nicholas Combs, a close and powerful ally of the Eversoles, was at home with his family. There was no warning, no challenge shouted in the street, just the sudden deafening blast of a rifle from the darkness. Nicholas Combs was shot dead on his own doorstep, in front of his wife and children. This wasn't a gunfight, it was an execution. The news spread through Hazard like a plague, and the town froze in a state of collective shock. For the Eversoles and their allies, grief was quickly replaced by a cold, hard rage. They now knew this was a fight to the death. The French clan had declared that there were no more rules, no more lines that wouldn't be crossed. The time for talking and maneuvering was over. They would fortify, they would arm themselves, and they would prepare for the final battle. The summer of 1889 arrived with a suffocating heat, and with it, the final storm. The French clan decided the time for waiting was over. They were coming for Hazard. They didn't sneak in under the cover of darkness. Led by the cold-eyed Tom Smith, nearly 100 men marched into town in broad daylight. Their boots kicked up the dust of Main Street, the sun glinting off the barrels of the Winchesters resting on their shoulders. This wasn't an attack. It was an invasion. Warned of their approach, the Eversoles and their men had turned the brick courthouse into a fortress. The windows were no longer glass. They were dark, jagged mouths, framed with sandbags and rifle muzzles. Snipers lay waiting on the roof, their eyes scanning the streets below. The town held its breath, the silence stretched thin and tight, and then a single shot cracked the air. The world dissolved into a storm of lead. For the people of Hazard, not aligned with either clan, the world became a cage. Women dragged their children into root cellars, their hands pressed over their children's ears as if they could block out the sounds that would haunt them forever. The constant whine of bullets, the splintering of wood as a stray round tore through a porch railing, the sharp metallic clang of a slug embedding itself in a cast-iron stove. A farmer, caught on the wrong side of the street when the shooting began, made a desperate run for home. He didn't make it. His body lay in the dusty road, a grim testament that in this war there were no innocent bystanders. Through the haze of gunsmoke, across the bullet-scarred square, two men found each other. Bad Tom Smith, using a wooden post for cover, and Sheriff Joe Eversole, firing from a shattered courthouse window. It became a personal duel in the heart of the chaos. Bullets tore splinters from the wood, inches from Smith's head. Brick dust exploded from the courthouse wall just beside the sheriff's face. This wasn't just a clan war anymore. It was a battle of two wills, two warriors deciding the fate of the town with every pull of the trigger. Day bled into night, and the shooting never truly stopped. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of burnt black powder. Inside the courthouse, the last of the water was gone. Thirst became an enemy as deadly as the rifles outside. The French clan controlled the streets, but they couldn't breach the brick walls. The Eversoles held the fortress, but they couldn't break the siege. Hazard was a town held hostage by its own sons, a stalemate of iron and lead, where every sunrise brought the certainty of more death. The war had come, and it had consumed everything. It wasn't a bullet that ended the war. It was a sound that didn't belong in the mountains of Perry County, the steady, rhythmic tramp of disciplined boots on a dusty road. Word of the siege had finally reached the governor, and he had sent in the state militia. They marched into Hazard not as peacemakers, but as an occupying army, their blue uniforms and gleaming bayonets a shocking sight against the backdrop of the battered town. This was a force that answered to no clan, a law that could not be bought or intimidated. The crack of rifles faltered, then died out completely. A stunned silence fell over the streets. From the rooftops and shattered windows, the fighters of the French clan stared in disbelief. They were prepared to die fighting the Eversoles, but they had no plan for this. This was a power they couldn't comprehend. With their siege broken and a new, unstoppable enemy in their midst, they did the only thing they could. They melted back into the hills and hollows from which they came, vanishing like ghosts into the forest. Slowly, the doors of the courthouse creaked open. The Eversoles and their men emerged, blinking in the harsh sunlight, their faces grimed with sweat and gunpowder. They were the victors of the siege, but they surveyed their town with the eyes of defeated men. The streets were scarred, buildings were pocked with bullet holes, and in the silence, the cost of their victory was all too clear. The war was over, but Hazard was a wound that would take generations to heal. The state militia didn't care about old grudges or who fired the first shot. They came to restore order, and their justice was swift and impartial. Warrants were issued for men on both sides. The local law, which had been a tool of the clans for so long, was swept aside. One by one, the men who had turned Hazard into a battlefield were rounded up, their rifles replaced with iron shackles. The era of mountain law was being extinguished right before their eyes. But there was one man the state wanted more than any other. One name that became the symbol of the entire bloody feud: Bad Tom Smith. He was the hired gun, the merciless enforcer. To the state, he wasn't just a participant, he was the disease. A massive manhunt was launched, with a price on his head that echoed through every corner of Kentucky. The war for Hazard was over, but the hunt for Bad Tom Smith had just begun. Bad Tom Smith was finally captured, not in a blaze of glory, but quietly, cornered and out of options. The authorities knew a trial in Perry County would be a farce. No jury would dare convict him. They'd be too afraid of the French clan's retribution. So they took him away, far from the mountains that had been his hunting ground, to a place where the name Bad Tom Smith was just a headline in a newspaper, not a boogeyman in the night. His fate would be decided by the mountains. The trial was a sensation, the greatest legal spectacle Kentucky had seen in years. The courtroom was packed every day. Farmers, lawyers, and ladies in fine hats all crowded onto the wooden benches, craning their necks to get a look at the legendary killer. Armed guards stood at every door, a visible sign that even here the fear of clan warfare lingered. This wasn't just a trial, it was a public dissection of the wild, violent world of the feuds, and the whole state was watching. But the man who sat in the defendant's chair was not the monster the crowd expected to see. The cold-eyed killer was gone. In his place sat a quiet, somber man. The stories that trickled out of the jail were bizarre. Bad Tom Smith, the terror of Hazard, had found God. He spent his days reading the Bible and praying with a preacher. Some in the courtroom smirked, calling it a desperate ploy for sympathy. But others who looked into his eyes saw not a cunning act, but a man wrestling with the ghosts of his past, a man preparing his soul for a final judgment. The prosecution painted him as the devil himself, a cold-blooded murderer for hire who brought a new level of savagery to an old feud. They paraded witnesses who spoke of his reign of terror, their voices shaking as they recalled the murder of Nicholas Combs. His defense lawyers tried to argue that he was merely a soldier in a war he didn't start, that in the mountains of Perry County, killing was just another tool of politics. But it was no use. The state didn't just want a conviction, it needed a symbol. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. When they filed back into the silent courtroom, their faces were stone. The foreman stood, unfolded a piece of paper, and in a clear voice that seemed to echo off the high ceilings, he pronounced the word, "Guilty." A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. The judge banged his gavel, and when silence was restored, he passed the sentence. Bad Tom Smith was to be taken from this place and hanged by the neck until dead. Was it justice? Perhaps. But as Bad Tom was led away in chains, a question hung in the air. The powerful men who had hired his gun, the clan leaders who had profited from the chaos and fanned the flames of hatred for years, they would face lesser charges or walk free altogether. The state needed to make an example, to prove that the age of the feudists was over. They needed a sacrifice on the altar of law and order, and they had found it in the one man whose reputation was black enough to carry the sins of all the others. With the death of Bad Tom Smith, the war for Hazard was truly over. The iron fist of the state had crushed the feud. The French and Eversole clans, bled dry by the conflict and their leaders either imprisoned or disgraced, saw their power shatter. The future that the Eversoles had fought for, one of industry and outside investment, did come to pass, but it wasn't their victory. The coal companies and the railroads moved in, a force far more powerful than any mountain clan. They bought the land, built their towns, and established a new order that had no room for the old codes of honor and blood. The era of the clans was over. Today, Hazard is a modern town. The old brick courthouse, the fortress at the heart of the siege, is long gone, replaced by a newer building. People walk the square where the battle raged, conducting business, running errands, most of them completely unaware that they are treading on ground once soaked in blood and black powder. The bullet scars have been plastered over, the ghosts paved into the asphalt. The town moved on, as towns do, burying its violent past beneath a foundation of progress. But the mountains don't forget so easily. If you know where to look, the echoes remain. Drive about an hour north to the town of Jackson, where the hanging took place, and you can find a quiet cemetery. There, under the shade of an old tree, is a simple, weathered stone marker. It marks the final resting place of Bad Tom Smith. The most feared man in eastern Kentucky lies in a peaceful grave, a stark, silent contrast to the violent storm that was his life. It's a physical link, a tangible piece of the story you can still touch. The names French, Eversole, and Combs are still woven into the fabric of Perry County. You'll see them on mailboxes down quiet country roads and in the phone book. The descendants of these warring families are now neighbors. Their children play in the same schoolyards, and the great feud has faded into the realm of family legend. It's a story told by grandparents, a dark piece of folklore about a wilder time. The town may have forgotten the war, but in the hills and hollows, the mountains remember everything. So we come back to the question that hung in the air like gun smoke on that summer day in 1889. What was the Hazard War really about? Was it a fight for political office? A dispute over timber rights? Or was it something deeper, something born from insulted honor or a crooked card game? In the end, the answer is that it was all of those things, and none of them. The first spark, whatever it was, had long since been consumed by a firestorm of pride and revenge. This wasn't just a feud between two families. It was the last bloody battle of a dying world against the one that was coming to replace it. This is a story etched into the very soul of Appalachia. It's a story about the fierce, indomitable spirit of the mountain people, a spirit that values loyalty and honor above all else, but one that could also curdle into a cycle of brutal, self-destructive violence. The hanging of Bad Tom Smith was more than just the execution of a single man. It was a public and deliberate message from the state of Kentucky. The unwritten laws of the mountains were finished. The age of the clan, the feud, and the regulator was being buried, and from its grave would rise a new order of coal companies, railroads, and contracts. On the day of his execution, as he stood on the gallows, Bad Tom Smith looked out at the crowd that had gathered to see him die. He was calm. He had made his peace. Before the black hood was pulled over his head, he spoke his final words, a phrase that would become an Appalachian legend, capturing the tragedy and the strange redemption of his entire life. He said, "Bad Tom Smith is dead. Good Tom Smith is going to heaven. Don't cry for me." On a snow-dusted morning in Frankfort, Kentucky, a single rifle shot cracked the winter air. The man who fell was William Goebel, and in that moment, he became the only sitting governor in American history to be assassinated. To half the state, he was a savior, a champion of the poor fighting the crushing power of the railroads. To the other half, he was a ruthless tyrant who stole an election and deserved his fate. So, was he a martyr for the common man, or a demagogue who finally met his end? Today, we trace the path that led to that fatal shot, to understand the man behind the legend and the dark truth of his murder. William Goebel was not born to the Kentucky elite. He was an outsider from the very beginning, the son of a German immigrant woodcarver who had fought for the Union Army. Growing up in Pennsylvania and later Covington, Kentucky, a bustling city across the river from Cincinnati, Goebel knew nothing of the bluegrass aristocracy or the ancient codes of the Appalachian hills. He was forged not in a mountain hollow, but in the gritty reality of a working-class border town. His inheritance wasn't land or a family name. It was a towering intellect, a bottomless ambition, and a permanent chip on his shoulder. From a young age, it was clear his mind was his greatest weapon. While other boys played, Goebel devoured books. He was a gifted student who apprenticed under the powerful politician John G. Carlyle, quickly mastering the intricate, often dirty, mechanics of law and politics. He sharpened his mind like a blade, learning that power wasn't something you were given, it was something you took inch by bloody inch. His battlefield was the courtroom and the backrooms of the State House, where he built a political machine that was ruthlessly efficient and fiercely loyal only to him. The moment that truly defined the man, the act that foreshadowed the governor, happened on the streets of Covington. Goebel, then a state senator, had a bitter rivalry with a local banker and political adversary named John Sanford. After a heated exchange of public insults, they met by chance outside Sanford's bank. Words turned to threats. Both men went for their guns. When the smoke cleared, John Sanford lay dead on the cobblestones. Goebel claimed self-defense, arguing Sanford drew first, and a jury acquitted him. But the event became his creation myth. The duel sent a chilling message across the Commonwealth. William Goebel was not a man to be trifled with. He would not be intimidated, he would not be insulted, and he would not back down, even if it meant a lethal confrontation in broad daylight. This single violent act cemented his reputation as a man of cold nerve, a political fighter who took every challenge as a personal war. It was the ultimate demonstration of his personal code. That code was a world away from the clan-based honor of the mountains. Goebel's loyalty wasn't to bloodkin, but to his political cause and the machine he built to serve it. His honor was tied to absolute victory. He saw the law not as a set of sacred principles, but as a tool, a weapon to be wielded against his enemies, the most powerful of which was the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, an entity he viewed as a corporate monster strangling the life out of the common people. This was the man, forged in ambition and violence, who set his sights on the governor's chair. Long before the governor's race that would seal his fate, William Goebel was the undisputed king of the Kentucky Senate. In the years leading up to the storm, he was at the peak of his power, a brilliant and feared legislative tactician. This was Goebel in his element, not as a target, but as a hunter. His supporters didn't just respect him, they revered him. They saw a man who had clawed his way up from nothing, using his formidable intellect to fight for them in the halls of power where they had never had a voice. His life's work was a single-minded crusade against the corporate behemoths that treated Kentucky like a private colony. Chief among them was the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. The L&N wasn't just a company, it was a shadow government. It owned politicians, controlled newspapers, and set freight rates so high that farmers often lost money just trying to get their crops to market. Goebel attacked them relentlessly, pushing for laws to regulate their rates, tax their vast properties, and break their stranglehold on the state's commerce. To the working man, he was David fighting Goliath. Goebel's personal life was entirely consumed by this fight. He was a lifelong bachelor, a man of simple, almost Spartan habits. He had no wife, no children, no home life to retreat to. His law office and the legislative chambers were his only sanctuary. His family was the tight-knit circle of political loyalists who stood by him, and the thousands of faceless farmers and miners who pinned their hopes on his success. The political crusade wasn't just his career, it was his entire existence. This singular focus earned him a fierce, almost fanatical loyalty from his followers. When he spoke, they heard a man who understood their struggles, who wasn't afraid to name their enemies, and who possessed the cold, hard will to do something about it. They knew he was ruthless. They knew he was a political boss who bent the rules. They didn't care. They believed he was using the devil's tools to fight the devil himself, and they loved him for it. This was the world William Goebel had built and sought to protect, a fragile coalition of the forgotten and the angry, united behind a leader as tough and unforgiving as the times themselves. It was a vision of Kentucky, where the power belonged not to the boardrooms in Louisville, but to the people in the fields and the mines. This was what was at stake, and for Goebel, it was a cause worth dying for. William Goebel's greatest strength was also his most profound, fatal weakness. A righteous fury that consumed everything in its path, including the very idea of compromise. He was so utterly convinced of his own moral superiority in the war against the corporations that he came to believe the rules of democracy were an inconvenience. In his mind, any action that led to his victory was not just justified. It was necessary for the salvation of the common man. He wasn't just fighting for the law, he believed he was the law. Nowhere was this flaw more apparent than in the creation of the infamous Goebel election law. This wasn't just a piece of legislation, it was a masterpiece of political warfare, as brilliant as it was corrupt. Pushed through the legislature by the sheer force of his will, the law created a state election commission, a three-man board controlled entirely by his own party, with the absolute power to review county returns, throw out votes, and certify the final winner. It was a legal mechanism for stealing an election, plain and simple. Republicans and even some of his fellow Democrats were aghast. They called it a license to steal, a force bill, an act of tyranny that destroyed the sanctity of the ballot box. But Goebel was deaf to their outrage. In his unbending self-righteousness, he saw their protests not as a legitimate defense of democracy, but as the desperate squeals of the corrupt establishment he was determined to crush. He couldn't see that in his quest to slay a monster, he was becoming one himself. This arrogance made him incredibly vulnerable. He saw his enemies as politicians and lawyers who could be beaten in a courtroom or outmaneuvered in the legislature. He failed to understand that by removing any possibility of a fair fight, he was changing the rules of the game entirely. He was backing men, hard men from the mountains who lived by a different code, into a corner where they felt their only recourse was not the ballot box, but the rifle. The Goebel election law was the ultimate act of pride, the crack in his armor that ran from top to bottom. It was a declaration that he could not and would not lose. By ensuring his own victory, he unknowingly wrote his own death warrant, creating a political powder keg and then daring his enemies to light the fuse. The gubernatorial election of 1899 was not a campaign. It was a contest of pure political bloodsport. The air across Kentucky was thick with accusations of bribery, voter intimidation, and outright fraud. And hanging over it all was the specter of the Goebel election law, a weapon waiting to be used. On election day, the Commonwealth held its breath. When the initial counts were tallied, a collective gasp went through the state. The Republican, William S. Taylor, had won by a razor-thin margin of just over 2,000 votes. For a man like William Goebel, this was not just a political defeat, it was a personal and unforgivable insult. He believed the mountain counties, the Republican strongholds, had stolen the election from him through widespread corruption. The people, in his view, had been tricked. But more importantly, his perfect system, his guaranteed path to victory, had been defied. The verdict of the voters was an affront to his entire crusade, and he would not accept it. His reaction was immediate and absolute. He did not hesitate. He did not concede. He declared war. Goebel immediately filed a formal contest of the election, turning the matter over to the very commission he had created. His political machine roared to life, preparing to use the full, crushing weight of the Goebel election law to invalidate just enough votes in Republican counties to reverse the outcome. To the Republicans, this was the ultimate betrayal of democracy. They had won the fight, and now Goebel was moving to steal the prize in broad daylight. This was the moment the conflict moved from the ballot box to the barrel of a gun. Enraged by Goebel's blatant attempt to overturn the election, Republican leaders sent out a call to arms. From the mountains of eastern Kentucky, a river of angry armed men began to flow towards Frankfort. These were not politicians, they were coal miners, farmers, and feudists, men with rifles on their shoulders and generations of distrust for the bluegrass Democrats in their hearts. They came by the trainload, over 1,000 strong, to make sure their governor, William Taylor, was inaugurated and that Goebbels' commission did not dare to steal their victory. Frankfurt was no longer a capital, it was a tinderbox. The State House grounds became an armed camp. The local militia was called in, but their loyalties were divided. Republican mountain men, bristling with Winchesters, faced off against Goebbels' democratic enforcers. The air crackled with tension. Goebbels' refusal to accept defeat, driven by his unshakable self-righteousness, was the spark. The arrival of the mountain men was the powder. All that was needed now was for someone to strike the match. The city of Frankfurt was no longer governing. It was holding its breath. The sight of armed mountain men on every corner was a warning more potent than any telegram. It was a physical manifestation of the state's rage, a clear signal that the political dispute was about to be settled by older, more brutal methods. The air itself was a warning, thick with the scent of coal smoke, cheap whiskey, and the metallic odor of impending violence. Any prudent man would have seen this and searched for an escape route. But William Goebbels was not a prudent man. Even within his own party, whispers of caution turned into pleas. The old guard of the Democratic Party, men who had managed Kentucky politics for decades through careful compromise and backroom deals, were terrified. They saw Goebbels' hardline stance not as strength, but as a form of madness that was about to tear the Commonwealth apart. They urged him to find a political solution, to let the courts decide, to offer some concession that would allow the armed men to go home. Goebbels viewed their advice with contempt. He saw them as weak, as part of the very establishment that had allowed the railroads to grow so powerful in the first place. His own bodyguards, former lawmen chosen for their nerve and loyalty, begged him to take precautions. They saw the cold, hard looks in the eyes of the mountain men. They knew a dozen good places for an ambush between Goebbels' hotel and the state capitol. They pleaded with him to vary his routine, to take a carriage, to stay indoors until the legislature had officially declared him governor. Goebbels refused. To show fear in his mind was to show weakness. He would walk the same path to the capital every day in open defiance. It was a daily act of political theater, a silent declaration that he was not afraid of these railroad thugs. You have to understand, Goebbels was so completely consumed by his crusade that he was blind to the nature of the threat. He saw the armed men not as a legitimate popular uprising, but as a rented army, paid for by the L&N Railroad. He believed they were bluffing, a show of force meant to intimidate him. He could not comprehend that for these men, this was not about money. It was about honor. They believed their votes had been stolen, their will had been spat upon, and they were prepared to kill and die to defend it. Every action he took pushed the situation closer to the brink. He pressed forward with the election contest, showing no signs of slowing down. He made public statements that were defiant and inflammatory, pouring fuel on an already raging fire. Each day that he walked, chin held high, past the glowering crowds of his armed enemies, he was rejecting another chance for peace. He was making his choice over and over again. With every warning ignored and every offer of caution rebuffed, the path narrowed. He had slammed and bolted every exit. The political machinery for overturning the election ground forward, and in response, the informal machinery of mountain justice began to grind as well. A violent outcome was no longer a possibility. It was an appointment William Goebbels was striding with grim determination to keep. On the night of January 29, 1900, Frankfurt was a city holding its breath in the dark. The state teetered on the precipice of civil war. It was on this night, in the tense quiet of his room at the Capitol Hotel, that William Goebbels was presented with one last, clear chance to walk away from the abyss. The offer came not from his enemies, but from his oldest friends, the seasoned Democratic leaders who now saw the abyss yawning before them. They came to him not as politicians, but as men pleading for the life of a friend and the soul of their state. They laid out a compromise, a final, desperate off-ramp. They would broker a deal with the Republican leadership. Both Goebel and Taylor would stand down, and a new, fair election would be held under the supervision of a neutral committee. It was a path back from the brink, a way to let the armed men go home and settle the matter with ballots, not bullets. It would cost Goebel the governor's chair for now, but it would save his life. For a long moment, the fate of Kentucky hung in the air of that smoke-filled room. You can just imagine the scene, the earnest, fearful faces of his allies, the muffled sounds of the armed camp outside, and William Goebel, silent, listening. This was his final crossroads. He could accept the compromise, live to fight another day, and pull his state back from the edge of chaos. He could choose life, or he could choose his crusade. But to William Goebel, compromise was just a prettier word for surrender. In his mind, to accept their offer was to admit that the L&N Railroad's army of thugs could stare down the will of the people and win. It was a betrayal of every farmer, every miner, every forgotten man who had placed his faith in him. A cold fire burned in his eyes. He cut his friends off with a sharp wave of his hand and gave them his answer. He would not back down. The election contest would proceed. He would be governor. And in that moment, in that quiet hotel room, the decision was made. He consciously and deliberately rejected the final offer of peace. His friends left his room that night with the heavy hearts of men who had just left awake. William Goebel stood alone, looking out his window toward the darkened dome of the old state capitol. He had an appointment to keep with destiny, and William Goebel was not a man to be late. The morning of January 30th was bitter cold. A thin blanket of snow covered Frankfurt, muffling the sounds of the city and painting the world in shades of grey and white. William Goebel buttoned his overcoat and stepped out into the frigid air. As always, 2 bodyguards fell into step beside him. It was a short walk from his hotel to the old state capitol, a walk he had made countless times, a walk that had become a daily act of defiance against the armed men who watched him from every corner. He was not thinking about rifles. He was thinking about victory. The legislature was set to meet that day, and he knew he had the votes. The long, brutal fight was almost over. The world around him seemed to fade into a blur of grim-faced men in wool coats and slouch hats. Their glares were meaningless. He was a creature of the law, of legislative maneuvering, of the backroom deal. The raw, physical threat of these mountain men felt primitive, almost irrelevant, to the game he was about to win. As he approached the Capitol grounds, the familiar crunch of his boots on the snow-covered path was the only sound in his world. He walked past the iron fountain, its water frozen into a silent sculpture. The grey limestone facade of the Capitol building loomed before him, the symbol of the prize he had fought for his entire life. The world narrowed to that single point, that doorway through which he would walk in a matter of hours as the rightful governor of Kentucky. Then a sound, sharp and violent, split the winter air. It wasn't the sound of an argument or a carriage backfiring. It was a single, dry crack, like a massive tree branch snapping in the frozen woods. It was a sound of finality. For an instant, William Goebel felt nothing. Then a giant, invisible hand seemed to slam into his chest, stealing his breath and knocking him from his feet. The world pitched sideways, the grey sky and the stone capitol swapping places. He was on the ground, the impossible cold of the snow soaking through his coat, a white-hot fire spreading through his body. He looked up, his mind struggling to understand what had just happened. Confusion gave way to a strange, chilling clarity. He saw the panicked faces of his bodyguards leaning over him. He could hear shouting now, a chaos of running feet and horrified screams erupting around him. He knew, in that moment, that the game was over. The rules had been changed. As his friends knelt by his side, he is said to have summoned his last reserve of strength, forcing out the words that would become his own epitaph. "Tell my friends to be brave and fearless and loyal to the common people." The echo of the rifle shot faded, leaving behind it a new and terrible silence. The political argument that had torn Kentucky apart for months was suddenly, permanently over. A single, unseen finger had pulled a trigger, and in the space of a heartbeat had plunged a Commonwealth into darkness. Panic seized the capital. The single shot had shattered the fragile truce, and in its place was pure chaos. Goebbels' allies, their faces masks of fury and disbelief, swarmed around their fallen leader. They lifted his bleeding body from the frozen ground and carried him, not to a hospital, but back to the Capitol Hotel. The hotel, which had been his political headquarters, was about to become his death chamber, his hospital, and, for a few fleeting days, the governor's mansion. Inside, as doctors worked frantically to save him, Goebel drifted in and out of consciousness. The bullet had torn through his lung, and every breath was an agony. But in the moments of lucidity, his state of mind was not one of regret or fear. It was one of cold, unyielding resolve. His body was a ruin, but his mind was still a fortress. He was told the legislature was in an uproar, that his enemies were in disarray. He knew, even as his life was draining away, that this was his moment. The assassin's bullet had not ended his fight. It had given him the final weapon he needed to win it. While Goebel lay dying, his political machine, the most formidable in Kentucky, executed its final, brilliant, and ruthless maneuver. With the Capitol in an uproar and the Republicans reeling from the accusation of murder, the Democratic-controlled legislature moved with breathtaking speed. They met in a chaotic session, officially invalidated the election results from the mountain counties, and declared William Goebel the rightful governor of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And so, in one of the most surreal and desperate acts in American political history, the Chief Justice of the Kentucky Supreme Court was rushed to Goebel's bedside. In that hotel room, heavy with the smell of chloroform and fear, surrounded by his weeping allies, the dying man raised his right hand. He swore the oath of office, his voice a ragged whisper. For 3 agonizing days, a ghost governed Kentucky from a deathbed. His first and only act was to sign an order disbanding the state militia that protected his rival. On February the 3rd, 1900, the fight finally went out of him. The end of his road had come. William Goebel, the 34th governor of Kentucky, was dead. His war, however, was just beginning. The shot that killed William Goebel did not bring peace. It unleashed a plague. His death was not the end of a war, but the beginning of a long and bitter occupation of the soul of Kentucky. The wreckage left behind was not measured in broken buildings, but in shattered lives and a poison of suspicion and hatred that seeped into the very soil of the Commonwealth for a generation. His personal tragedy immediately became everyone's tragedy. For his political allies, victory was a poisoned chalice. His lieutenant governor, J.C.W. Beckham, now sat in the governor's chair, but the office was haunted. They had won power, but it was power consecrated in blood, and now they were bound by a sacred duty to avenge their fallen leader. This quest for vengeance would consume them, turning the machinery of justice into an instrument of political retribution and ensuring the wounds would never be allowed to heal. The most immediate wreckage was visited upon the men from the mountains. Overnight, Republicans became assassins in the public eye. Men like Caleb Powers, the Secretary of State, and Jim Howard, the Clay County feudist, were hunted down. Their names were transformed from political players into murderers. The lives of their families were destroyed. They faced years of imprisonment, sensational trials, and the crushing weight of being blamed for a crime that had pushed their state to the brink of anarchy. They were the first, but not the last, to be consumed by the fire Goebel's death had started. Across Kentucky, the assassination carved a line of blood between neighbors. The old political divide between the Republican mountains and the Democratic bluegrass was no longer a matter of opinion. It was a feud. Friendships ended, business partnerships dissolved, and families were torn apart by allegiance. The name Goebel became either a martyr's cry or a villain's curse, and there was no ground in between. The trust in government, in the law, in the very idea that a dispute could be settled peacefully, was utterly shattered. William Goebel, the lifelong bachelor, had no children to mourn him, but in a way he left behind thousands of orphans, the common people he championed. Their great hero was gone, and in his place was a legacy of division and a cycle of vengeance that did nothing to ease their poverty or break the power of the railroads. The bullet that struck him down had ricocheted through the entire state, and its final victims were the very people he had sworn to protect. The law that came for the accused killers of William Goebel was not a blindfolded goddess holding a set of scales. It was a vengeful spirit, cloaked in the robes of the state and armed with a prosecutor's fury. The series of trials that followed were not a search for truth. They were the final battle of the Goebel War, fought in a courtroom instead of on the street. The main targets were dragged from the mountains and into a world they did not understand. Caleb Powers, the Republican Secretary of State, branded the mastermind, and James Howard, the feudist from Clay County, accused of being the man who pulled the trigger. This was the heart of the conflict, a clash of two irreconcilable worlds. You have to picture it. A man like Jim Howard, a product of the Clay County feuds where disputes were settled face-to-face with a revolver, being tried by the complex machinery of state law. The prosecution painted him as a cold-blooded assassin, a hired gun. But to men who lived by the mountain code, assassination was a coward's work. The code demanded you look your enemy in the eye. The idea of shooting a man in the back from a hidden window was not just a crime, it was a profound dishonor, a stain on a man's name worse than death itself. Howard and Powers defended themselves with a simple, rugged denial that seemed hopelessly naive against the state's intricate, politically charged conspiracy theories. The trials themselves were a spectacle of partisan rage. The new Democratic administration, led by Goebel's successor, oversaw the prosecution. Juries were packed with loyal Democrats. Testimony was coerced, witnesses were intimidated, and evidence seemed to materialize from thin air. A clerk named Henry Utsi confessed, implicating the others in a story that conveniently fit the prosecution's narrative, a confession many believed was given under duress to save his own skin. It was a legal bludgeon designed not to uncover a fact, but to secure a conviction at any cost. The community's reaction was as divided as the state itself. In the bluegrass and the cities, newspapers proclaimed that Goebel's murderers were finally facing their reckoning. They were seen as traitors, the agents of a corrupt railroad, and no punishment was too severe. But in the mountains, a different story was told. To them, Powers and Howard were not criminals. They were political prisoners, martyrs framed by the very same democratic machine that had stolen the election. They were heroes, sacrificed on the altar of Goebel's ambition. The verdicts came in again and again. Guilty. Powers and Howard were sentenced to hang, then sentenced to life in prison over the course of multiple, grueling trials. But the ink was barely dry before appeals courts, looking at the tainted evidence and partisan atmosphere, overturned the verdicts. For 8 long years, the men languished in prison while the legal war raged on. In the end, was justice served? Not even close. The trials did not deliver clarity. They only cemented the divisions. They were a legal feud, as bitter and personal as any fought with rifles in the hills of eastern Kentucky. The final judgment came not from a jury, but from a Republican governor who, years later, pardoned the last of the men still in prison. The law had failed. It had picked its villains, held its show trials, and ultimately had let the true killer of William Goebel remain a ghost. So what became of the men who stood against William Goebel? If this were a simple story, his death would have meant their victory. But in the tangled, bloody history of Kentucky, there are no clean endings. The other side of this coin is not stamped with triumph, but with its own dark and complicated fate. Consider William S. Taylor, the Republican who won the election only to have it stolen from him. Did he rise to power over his rival's grave? No. He became a man without a country. Implicated in the assassination plot and facing indictment by a vengeful Democratic administration, Governor Taylor was forced to flee. He escaped across the river into Indiana, a political exile, never to set foot in his home state again. He lived out the rest of his days as an insurance lawyer in Indianapolis, a man who won an election and lost everything. And what of the true antagonist, the shadow government that Goebel had dedicated his life to fighting? The L&N Railroad had seemingly won the ultimate victory. Their most dangerous and implacable enemy was gone, silenced forever. But the ghost of William Goebel proved to be a more formidable foe than the man ever was. His assassination transformed him from a ruthless politician into a populist martyr. His name became a holy word, a rallying cry for the very reforms he had championed. The movement he started didn't die with him. It was consecrated by his blood, and the fight against the railroad monopolies continued with a religious fervor for years to come. In the end, no one truly won. The men accused of the murder saw their lives shattered. The governor who defeated Goebel at the polls died in exile, and the corporation that wanted him gone created a legend that would haunt them for a generation. The other side of the coin, it turns out, was just as cursed. In the years that followed, Kentucky did not so much heal as it learned to live with a festering wound. The aftermath of the assassination was not a period of reconciliation, but one of grim consolidation. William Goebel left behind no wife or children, but he did have descendants of another kind, the political machine he built and the cause he embodied. His hand-picked successor, J.C.W. Beckham, rode a wave of public sympathy and righteous anger, establishing a Democratic dynasty that would dominate Kentucky politics for decades. The Goebel Democrats, once the insurgents, now became the establishment, their power cemented by the blood of their martyr. For the families of the accused, the legacy was a curse. Even after the eventual pardons, the names of Powers and Howard were forever stained. Their children and grandchildren grew up in the long, cold shadow of the gallows, marked as the kin of assassins. They lived under a cloud of suspicion and shame, a constant, unspoken reminder of the state's darkest hour. For them, the trials never truly ended. They simply became a life sentence of inherited infamy, a ghost they could never escape. The community of Frankfort and Kentucky as a whole rebuilt itself by choosing to forget. A great, unspoken pact of silence descended upon the state. The assassination was too traumatic, the divisions too deep, the truth too murky. To speak of it was to risk reopening the wound, to reignite the hatreds that had almost plunged the Commonwealth into civil war. So they buried it. The story became a dark whisper, a piece of forbidden history passed down in hushed tones, a communal trauma hidden beneath a blanket of polite, desperate silence. But beneath that silence, the power dynamics of the state had been fundamentally and irrevocably altered. The Republican Party in Kentucky was crippled, branded as the party of murderers, a stigma that would take them more than a generation to overcome. And ironically, the L&N Railroad, the great corporate beast Goebel had fought, found itself facing a far more hostile world. Goebel the man could be beaten, but Goebel the martyr was invincible. His death had galvanized the public against corporate overreach in a way his political maneuvering never could. The fall of the man had ensured the rise of his cause. If you walk the grounds of the old state capitol in Frankfort today, you can still feel the chill of that January morning. A bronze plaque marks the very spot where William Goebel fell, a silent testament to the moment Kentucky's history was violently broken. You can look across the lawn to the old state annex building, to the third-floor window from which the fatal shot was fired, and feel a shiver crawl down your spine. The buildings are now museums, but on that patch of ground, the past is not past. It is a cold spot that never thaws. A short drive away, in the Frankfort Cemetery, stands Goebel's final monument, one of the grandest in the state. A towering obelisk pierces the sky, with a bronze statue of the man, defiant even in death, standing guard. His grave is not a place of quiet rest. It is a political statement carved in stone, a permanent declaration of his martyrdom. It's a pilgrimage site for political junkies and history buffs, a physical reminder of the man who became more powerful in death than he ever was in life. But Goebel's ghost doesn't just haunt these physical places. It lives in the stories. His assassination became the stuff of legend, a dark and bloody folktale told in the back rooms of the State House and around kitchen tables in the mountains. Folk singers wrote ballads about the man who fought the railroad and was shot down in the snow. His name became a cautionary tale whispered to young, ambitious politicians, a warning about the deadly consequences of pride and the refusal to compromise. The story persists more than a century later because it is a perfect, unsolved mystery. The question of who truly killed William Goebel was never answered, and so it can never die. Was it the Mountain Republicans avenging a stolen election? Was it a shadowy railroad conspiracy silencing a threat to their profits? Or was it the darkest theory of all, a dissident Democrat, tired of his tyrannical rule, who pulled the trigger knowing his enemies would take the fall? The lack of a definitive answer allows the ghost to belong to everyone, his legend shaped and reshaped to fit any political narrative. And so, the spirit of William Goebel still walks the halls of Kentucky politics. Goebel's ghost became a term for the lingering bitterness, the deep partisan hatred that can still erupt in the state. The man is gone, his bones turned to dust beneath that stone monument. But the fury, the division, and the unanswerable question of his end, that part of him is immortal. It haunts the Commonwealth, a permanent echo of a single rifle shot on a cold winter morning. So, we come back to the very beginning, standing over the ghost of a man shot down in the snow. Was William Goebel a hero or a villain, a martyr or a tyrant? The hard truth, the one that a century of dust and argument has left us with, is that he was both. He was a man who saw a great evil, the unchecked power of corporations strangling the life from his state, and he chose to fight it with a fire so fierce it consumed everything, including himself and the very democratic principles he claimed to defend. In the end, this isn't just the story of a political assassination. It's a timeless Appalachian tragedy about how a man's greatest strength can become his most profound and fatal weakness. It's a chilling lesson on the poison of absolute certainty, a warning that when a man becomes so convinced he is on the side of the angels, he can't see that he's started using the devil's own tools. It is the story of a modern political machine crashing headlong into the ancient, unbending code of the mountains and the explosion that followed. The shot that killed William Goebel was an echo of 1,000 conflicts born in these hills, a brutal reminder that when you strip away the laws and the politics, some things are only settled with blood. It's a story about a war for the soul of a state, a war that left no victors, only ghosts. And that, my friends, is the ballad of William Goebel, the man who fought a war for the common people, but whose own pride was the one enemy he could never defeat. Imagine the scene. A lone cabin in the backwoods of North Carolina, burning against the blackness of a moonless night. Inside, amidst the smoke and embers, an entire family has been slaughtered. The father, the mother, 4 small children, all gone. But when the neighbors finally pull a body from the flames, they discover the impossible. The mother, Polly Weston, is still breathing, but a fire of pure vengeance is keeping her alive just long enough to whisper 2 names. The newspapers called it the Weston House Massacre. But those who lived in these mountains knew the official version was just the tip of the iceberg. It was a story of a fatal glance, a blood oath, and a question that still hangs in the air today. What truly brought the wrath of the Adair brothers down upon that little family? Today, we will sift through the ashes of that cabin, separate the facts from the folklore, and find out what really happened on that fateful night. To understand the tragedy, you first have to understand the world it destroyed. This was Rutherford County, North Carolina, in 1871. The scars of the Civil War were still raw and weeping across the South. In these hills and hollows, the official law was a distant whisper, easily drowned out by the crack of a rifle or the sizzle of a moonshine still. It was a land of breathtaking beauty and brutal hardship, a place where good men tried to carve out a life while monsters roamed the shadows. In this world lived Silas Weston. He was not a hero of legend or a man of great wealth. He was a man of the earth. His hands were calloused from the plow, his face weathered by the sun, but his heart was full. His treasure wasn't gold. It was the sound of his wife Polly singing in their small cabin and the laughter of his 4 children playing in the yard. Their life was a simple one, governed by the seasons and the sweat of their brow. They were humble people, asking for nothing more than what they could earn from the soil, a small island of warmth and light in a cold, uncertain time. But this land was also home to a different kind of man, men like Grover and Columbus Adair. They were not men of the earth, they were predators of the forest. Where Silas saw a field to plant, they saw a place to bury a body. They were the dark reflection of the Appalachian spirit, fiercely independent, but twisted into something malevolent by greed and a thirst for power. Their names were spoken in hushed tones, a local plague that everyone knew about, but no one dared to cure. They were the kings of the backwoods, their throne built on fear. Grover was the mind of the operation, cold and sharp as a winter wind. He planned the robberies, managed the illegal whiskey trade, and passed judgment on anyone who crossed them. Columbus was his brother's fury made flesh, a brute of a man, quick to anger and terrifying in his rage. Together, they were a perfect engine of destruction. They didn't just break the law, they considered themselves to be the law in the dark corners of the county where the sheriff's authority couldn't reach. These two worlds, the simple sunlit life of the Westons and the violent shadowy empire of the Adairs, existed side by side, separated by only a few miles of woods and a moral chasm as wide as the ocean. They were two forces of nature bound to collide. For Silas Weston, a man who lived by honesty and hard work, was unknowingly walking a path that led directly into the heart of the Adairs' darkness. And he was about to learn that in this fractured land, a single glance could be a death sentence for an entire family. The spark that ignited this hellfire wasn't a land dispute or a family feud. It was something far simpler and far more terrifying, a man taking a wrong turn on his way home. Silas Weston, weary from a day's work, took a little used path through the woods, a shortcut he thought might get him back to his family a few minutes sooner. But that path led him straight into the heart of the Adairs' world. There, in a secluded clearing, he saw them, Grover, Columbus, and their accomplice Martin Bernard, unloading barrels of illegal whiskey from a wagon. It was the lifeblood of their criminal enterprise, laid bare under the dappled sunlight. For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. The world shrunk to the space between them. It wasn't just a glance, it was a conversation without words. In Silas's eyes, the brothers saw a flash of recognition, followed by the cold bloom of fear. And in the Adairs' eyes, Silas saw something far worse than anger. He saw a calm, dead-eyed calculation. He had stumbled behind the curtain and seen the monsters for who they were. He was a witness. In that silent clearing, a judgment was passed and a death sentence was signed. Silas did the only thing a man in his position could do. He gave a slight, nervous nod, turned his back, and walked away, every nerve in his body screaming. He didn't run. He knew that would be a confession of his fear. He just walked, forcing himself to keep a steady pace, feeling the weight of their stare on his back like a physical blow. His only thought was of Polly and the children. He had to get back to the warmth of his cabin, back to the life that suddenly felt so fragile, as if it were made of glass. But the Adair brothers weren't the kind to let a problem walk away. For them, a witness was like a seed of disease that had to be burned out before it could sprout. As soon as Silas was out of sight, a look passed between Grover and Columbus. No words were needed. Grover, the strategist, saw a loose thread that could unravel their entire operation. Columbus, the brute, saw an offense that had to be answered with overwhelming force. This wasn't a matter of if they would act, but how and when. The hunt began immediately. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, patient, and methodical. They followed his tracks. They learned the location of his small farm. They watched his cabin from the tree line, observing the simple, happy life within. They were no longer just criminals. They were wolves circling a homestead, waiting for the sun to set. For the Adairs, this wasn't about silencing a man anymore. It was about making a statement, a brutal lesson written in blood for anyone else who might dare to look upon their secrets. Night fell on the western homestead like a shroud. Inside the small cabin, a family slept, warmed by the embers in the hearth, dreaming simple dreams. That peace was shattered in an instant by the sound of splintering wood as the cabin door was kicked from its hinges. The cold, dark air that rushed in carried with it the stench of whiskey and raw violence. Two hulking shadows filled the doorway, their forms monstrous against the faint moonlight. Silas Weston was on his feet before he was fully awake, a father's instinct his only weapon. He moved to stand between the invaders and his family, a final, desperate act of defiance. There was a brief, furious struggle, a man's desperate cry cut short by a sickening, heavy thud. When the screaming started, Silas was no longer standing. He had fallen face down onto the dirt floor of the home he had built with his own two hands. Polly's world became a whirlwind of terror. She tried to gather her children, to shield their small bodies with her own, but the shadows were on her in a heartbeat. She didn't see the blades as much as she felt them, a series of sharp, blinding impacts that stole her breath. One of the men stood over her, and a final crushing weight descended upon her head. The world dissolved into a crimson blur. Through a haze of pain and fading consciousness, the sounds became her entire reality. The sounds would be seared into her memory forever. The terrified cries of her children calling for their mother, for their father who would never answer. She fought to stay awake, fought to get up, but her body wouldn't obey. And then, one by one, the small voices were extinguished, fading into a silence that was more terrifying than any scream had ever been. The work was done. The two brothers moved through the cabin with a calm, businesslike efficiency. They were no longer raging beasts, but methodical executioners cleaning up a job. One of them nudged a small, carved wooden horse with the toe of his boot, a silent witness to the night's horrors, before turning away. There was no remorse in their movements, only purpose. They began to splash a pungent liquid over the walls, the floors, and the still forms that lay upon them. The sharp scent of kerosene filled the air, a promise of purification by fire. A match was struck, its tiny flame a flicker of pure evil in the gloom. It was tossed onto the saturated floorboards, and with a hungry roar, the cabin began to burn. The Adair brothers stepped back out into the night, confident that the inferno would consume their crime, leaving nothing behind but ash, silence, and the ghosts of a family that had dared to look them in the eye. For hours, the western cabin was a silent pyre, its orange glow a lone, malevolent eye in the vast darkness. It was that glow that first alerted the neighbors. They came running, buckets in hand, their hearts pounding with a dreadful premonition. But as they drew closer, the heat and the roar of the flames pushed them back. There was nothing to be saved. All they could do was watch helplessly as the home of their friends and the family within it were consumed. When dawn broke, it revealed a scene of utter desolation. A smoking, blackened square on the earth was all that remained. Men with grim faces and heavy hearts began the terrible work of sifting through the debris. They found Silas first, then, one by one, his children. Grief hung thick in the air, a choking smoke that burned worse than the fire. They worked in a stunned silence, their minds unable to process the scale of such evil. And then, one of the men let out a choked cry. Among the wreckage, they found Polly Weston. She was a ruin of a human being, her body a testament to the savagery she had endured. They assumed she was dead, another victim to be mourned. But as they moved to cover her, a faint, rattling breath escaped her lips. It was impossible. No one could survive such wounds, such a fire. But Polly Weston was not just anyone. She was a mother whose children had been stolen from her, and something inside her, a core of pure, unyielding maternal rage, refused to let go. The sheriff arrived to find a crowd standing in horrified reverence around the barely living woman. He knelt beside her, his own throat tightening at the sight. He leaned in close, putting his ear to her bloody lips, expecting a final garbled prayer. But what he heard was not a prayer. It was a verdict. In a voice that was little more than a whisper of air and blood, she gave him the names. The Adair brothers, Groven, and Columbus. That whisper was all it took. The names shot through Rutherford County like a bolt of lightning, igniting a fury that the Civil War itself hadn't managed to kindle. This wasn't a crime against one family. It was an assault on humanity itself. The shock of the massacre gave way to a wave of cold, hard rage. These weren't just murderers. They were a cancer that had been allowed to fester in the dark hollows for too long. Now, it was time to cut it out. Within hours, the county transformed. Farmers left their plows rusting in the fields and took up their hunting rifles. Veterans who had fought at Gettysburg and Antietam formed posses, their old military discipline snapping back into place. A formal reward was offered, but for these men, it wasn't about money. It was a debt of blood, and the entire community was rising as one to collect it. The Adair brothers, who had been the hunters just the night before, were now the most sought-after prey in the state of North Carolina. The manhunt was brutally efficient. The Adair brothers, who had moved through these woods like vengeful spirits, were found to be nothing more than flesh and blood. They were cornered, captured, and dragged back to town to face the community they had terrorized. Stripped of their weapons and their freedom, they were no longer kings of the hollows, but caged beasts, their eyes burning with a hateful, impotent rage as they were thrown into the county jail. Their accomplice, Martin Bernard, was captured alongside them, his face a mask of pure terror. The trial was less a legal proceeding and more a public ritual. On July 21, 1871, the town square was a sea of grim-faced humanity. Thousands of people had come from all over the region, not out of morbid curiosity, but out of a need to witness the final act. The courtroom was packed to the rafters, the air thick with the smell of sweat and a thirst for retribution. Armed men stood guard, less to prevent the prisoners from escaping and more to prevent the crowd from storming the courthouse and dispensing their own brand of justice. The prosecution's case was simple and devastating. They didn't need complex legal arguments or a mountain of circumstantial evidence. They had something far more powerful. They had Polly Weston. She was helped to the witness stand, a spectral figure wrapped in bandages, her body frail, but her gaze as hard and unyielding as mountain granite. When she was asked to identify the men who attacked her family, a hush fell over the room. She slowly raised a trembling hand and pointed a finger, first at Grover, then at Columbus. Her voice, though weak, was clear and steady, and every word fell upon the jury like a hammer blow. Throughout the testimony, the brothers reacted true to their nature. Columbus seethed in his chair, his knuckles white, glaring at the jury as if he could intimidate them into submission. Grover sat with a cold, defiant stillness, a faint, contemptuous smirk playing on his lips. There was no remorse in their eyes, no flicker of regret, only a profound arrogance, an unshakable belief that the world was theirs to break. They seemed offended not by the accusation of murder, but by the sheer audacity of these simple farmers daring to hold them accountable. The jury barely needed to deliberate. The evidence wasn't just what they had heard, it was the living, breathing proof of the Adair's evil sitting right there on the witness stand. They filed out and returned in what seemed like minutes. The foreman stood, his face set like stone, and delivered the verdict that everyone in that room already knew was coming. Guilty. The sentence followed swiftly. Death by hanging. A great cathartic roar erupted from the crowd both inside and outside the courthouse. It wasn't a cheer of celebration, but a deep, primal sound of relief, of a fever finally breaking. Justice had been served. But looking at the sea of faces, filled with a righteous and terrible satisfaction, one had to ask, was this the justice of men, carefully weighed on the scales of the law? Or was this the justice of the mountains, ancient and unforgiving? The law had provided the rope, but it was the community's fury that had tied the knot. The hangman's noose silenced the Adair brothers, but it couldn't silence their story. In fact, their deaths were just the beginning. The tale of the Western Massacre immediately began to grow roots, sinking deep into the soil of local legend, and some of those roots can still be traced today. The first and most baffling loose end was the third man, Martin Bernard. While awaiting his own execution, his wife came for a final visit. In an act of incredible daring, they swapped clothes. Bernard, hiding his face behind a woman's veil, walked calmly out of the jail while his wife remained in the cell. He was never seen again, vanishing into the mists of history and leaving a question mark that hangs over the story to this day. Bernard's mysterious escape gave birth to another enduring legend, the Adair treasure. Like so many outlaws of that era, the brothers were said to have buried their ill-gotten gains somewhere in the rugged hills of Rutherford County. Many believed Bernard didn't just flee for his life, he fled to reclaim a fortune in stolen gold and cash. To this day, there are those who comb the forests and search the old caves, guided by faded maps and local rumors, still hunting for the blood money of the Adair brothers. But the most powerful echoes of that night are not of treasure, but of tragedy. The patch of land where the western cabin once stood is considered hollow ground, a place forever scarred by grief. Locals will tell you that the woods there are unnaturally quiet, as if the birds themselves refuse to sing. They say that on still, moonless nights, you can sometimes hear the faint sound of a child crying on the wind. Some have even claimed to see a ghostly figure of a woman, forever wandering the trees where her home once stood, eternally searching for the children she lost. The land remembers the villains as well. For decades, the tree on which the brothers were hanged, or the ground where the gallows stood, was a place of superstition and dread. It was said to be cursed, that the violent, unrepentant souls of Grover and Columbus Adair were bound to the instrument of their own demise. No one dared cut the tree down, fearing that to do so would unleash their evil back into the world. It stood for years as a dark monument, a silent reminder that while justice can be served, some evils leave a stain that can never be washed away. These places, these stories, are the true legacy of that night, not written in history books, but etched into the memory of the mountains themselves. So we come back to the question that hung in the smoke of that burning cabin. What truly happened on that fateful night? The simple answer is that Silas Weston saw something he was not meant to see. But the deeper truth is that for men like Grover and Columbus Adair, his innocence was his crime. They didn't just kill a witness, they sought to annihilate a world that was the complete opposite of their own, a world of family, honesty, and light. There is, of course, a darker whisper, a rumor with no proof, that Silas was a former partner who tried to walk away. We may never know for certain, but in the end, it doesn't change the outcome. only adds another layer of tragic shadow to the tale. This story, etched into the history of Appalachia, is not simply a tale of monstrous cruelty. It is a testament to an almost superhuman will. Polly Weston, broken and left for dead, became the instrument of a justice more powerful than any lawman's badge. Her survival, fueled by a mother's rage, is what transformed a hidden crime into a public reckoning. This is the enduring lesson of the blood brothers of Adair, that while evil can be absolute, the strength of the human spirit, the will to live, to fight, and to see justice done for the ones we love can sometimes be even stronger. The Adair brothers are long gone, their bodies turned to dust. The treasure, if it ever existed, likely remains lost to the earth. But the story endures, passed down from one generation to the next, a chilling campfire tale with roots buried deep in the hard soil of truth. It serves as a brutal reminder of the darkness that men are capable of, and the incredible, impossible strength that can rise from the ashes of tragedy. The official records are closed, the graves have settled, but in the hills of North Carolina, the story is never truly over. On a bright May morning in 1866, a young woman named Laura Foster packed a small bundle of clothes, told her father she was running off to be married, and rode her father's mare into the misty folds of the Blue Ridge Mountains. She was supposed to meet her lover, the handsome fiddler and war veteran Tom Dooley. But Laura Foster never arrived at their meeting spot. She was swallowed whole by the wilderness, leaving behind only whispers and a riderless horse that wandered home days later. What happened to Laura Foster on that hillside? Was it a simple crime of passion, the tragic end to a tangled love affair? Or was it something more sinister, a conspiracy of silence, a dark secret protected by an entire mountain community, a truth so twisted it would be immortalized in a folk song that haunts us to this day? Today, we become detectives of the past, sifting through the legends and lies to finally answer the question, who was truly responsible for the crime that created the legend of Tom Dooley? To understand what was lost, you have to understand the world that was. Wilkes County, North Carolina in 1866 was a land of breathtaking beauty and brutal hardship. The Civil War had ripped through these mountains, leaving not just economic ruin, but deep scars on the souls of the men who returned. They came back from the battlefields and prison camps to a world of poverty and uncertainty, their pockets empty and their hearts full of ghosts. This was a place of fierce clan loyalty, where disputes were settled by family and honor was a currency more valuable than cash. The air in these hollows was thick with pride, resentment, and unspoken tensions, a perfect tinderbox waiting for a single, fatal spark. At the center of this world was Laura Foster. By all accounts, she was a simple country girl, known throughout the valley for her striking beauty and a gentle nature. She lived a quiet life on her father's farm, her world defined by the seasons and the hard work of the land. Her dream was a common one, but for her, it was everything. To marry the man she loved, Tom Dooley. She was desperately, foolishly in love. A love so powerful, it blinded her to the dangerous currents swirling just beneath the surface of their lives. She was a wildflower, beautiful and vibrant, unknowingly blooming on the edge of a cliff. Then there was Thomas Dooley, the man they call Tom Dooley. Before the war, he was the prodigal son of the valley, impossibly handsome, a gifted fiddle player whose music could charm the birds from the trees and women into his arms. But the boy who went to fight for the 42nd North Carolina Infantry was not the man who came back. The war and the squalor of a Union prison camp had forged a darkness in him. The easy charm was still there, but it was now laced with a restless, reckless energy. He was a moth drawn to the flame of trouble, and in turn, he was a flame that drew others to their doom. And you cannot tell this story without Ann Melton. Ann was Laura's cousin, a woman of breathtaking beauty and a will of iron. Many believed she was Tom's first and truest love, a bond forged long before the war. While Tom was away, she made a practical choice, marrying an older, stable farmer named James Melton. But her marriage did little to tame the fire she felt for Tom. She was cunning, captivating, and deeply possessive. Anne Melton was the queen of this small, tangled kingdom, and she was not the kind of woman who tolerated rivals. These three lives were knotted together in a web of passion and jealousy that was an open secret in the community. Tom Dooler was courting Laura Foster openly, while just as openly carrying on his affair with the married Anne Melton. It was a dangerous game played in a community where everyone watched and everyone whispered. But even in their quiet lives, a darker shadow was gathering, unseen and unspoken. It was a secret sickness, a shameful disease brought back from the war, and a rumor of a pregnancy that threatened to unravel everything, turning a common love triangle into a matter of life and death. For weeks, the mountains held their secret. The initial search for Laura Foster had turned up nothing but tired men and unanswered prayers. Her father's mare had been found, wandering aimlessly, its saddle empty. As spring turned to summer, a grim silence settled over the valley. It was as if Laura had ridden into the morning mist and been erased from the world. The whispers continued, of course, but without a body, there was no crime, only a heartbreaking disappearance and a community left to wonder. The break in the case didn't come from a lawman's keen eye or a hunter's chance discovery. It came from the fevered ramblings of a woman named Pauline Foster, a cousin to both Laura and Anne, who worked on the Melton farm. Pauline, known to be suffering from the late stages of syphilis which often rotted the mind, began to have what she called visions. She claimed in moments of strange clarity that she knew where Laura was buried. No one knew whether to believe her ravings, but in the face of a dead-end search, desperation won out. Guided by Pauline's bizarre and unsettling directions, a search party made their way to a lonely, rhododendron-choked hillside. At first, they saw nothing, but then one of the men noticed it, a patch of earth that was slightly sunken, the leaves on top unnaturally disturbed. It was a scar on the landscape that didn't belong. With shovels and grim determination, they began to dig into the soft, dark soil. The stench that rose from the ground told them they had found her before their eyes ever could. What they unearthed was a horror. The body of Laura Foster, wrapped in a blanket, was pulled from the shallow grave. She was badly decomposed after months in the warm earth, but one brutal fact was unmistakable. A single deep wound pierced her chest, a wound made with a large knife, delivered with vicious force. There were no other signs of a struggle, just that one fatal act of violence. The burial was hasty, panicked. This wasn't a calculated execution. It was a desperate attempt to hide a body and a terrible secret. The discovery of the grave didn't bring clarity. It brought a new kind of confusion. The scene spoke of chaos and concealment, but the wilderness offered no easy answers. The only witness was a woman whose testimony was born of sickness and visions. The only real clue was the nature of the wound itself, a clue that pointed toward a man's strength and a man's weapon. The body had been found, but the truth remained buried, and the questions had only just begun to multiply. From the moment Laura Foster's body was pulled from the earth, one name was on everyone's lips: Tom Dooler. Suspicion didn't just fall on him. It crashed down with the weight of inevitability. He was the man she was running away to meet, the last person known to have plans with her. In the tight-knit world of Wilkes County, where everyone knew everyone else's business, the tangled love affair between Tom, Laura, and Anne Melton was common knowledge. Tom was the central figure, the sun around which these women orbited, and when one of them was extinguished, all eyes naturally turned to him. The motive seemed painfully obvious, a story as old as the mountains themselves. The community saw a man trapped between two women, a reckless philanderer who had finally gotten in too deep. The whispers claimed Laura Foster was pregnant with Tom's child, an entanglement that would have forced his hand and ruined his chances with Anne Melton, the woman many believed he truly loved. An even darker rumor circulated that Tom had given Laura a foul disease, syphilis, and she had threatened to expose him, bringing shame and ruin upon them all. In either version of the story, Laura Foster had become a problem, an obstacle to be removed. The circumstantial evidence was damning. The deep, single stab wound in Laura's chest was consistent with the large blade Tom was known to carry, a hunting knife he had brought back from the war. But the most condemning piece of evidence was his own action. As the search for Laura intensified and suspicion began to coil around him, Tom Dula did the one thing an innocent man should never do. He ran. He saddled a horse and fled across the state line into Tennessee, living and working under a false name. This flight was seen by everyone as a confession written across the landscape of two states. Why would an innocent man abandon his home, his family, and his name? To the people of Wilkes County, the answer was simple. He wouldn't. Tom's escape solidified the whispers into a hard, cold certainty. He wasn't just a suspect anymore. He was a fugitive and a murderer. In the court of public opinion, the verdict was already in. But as the shadow of the gallows began to fall over Tom Dula, another, more chilling possibility took root in the minds of the mountain folk. It was a story whispered over hearth fires, a theory that pointed not to the runaway lover, but to the woman at the very center of the storm, Anne Melton. She was Laura's own cousin, the woman who shared her bloodline and her lover. No one was closer to the heart of the tragedy, and many began to wonder if she wasn't the heart of the crime itself. The motive was primal and powerful, a jealousy so fierce it could curdle blood. Anne Melton was not a woman who shared. She was Tom's first love, and in her mind, his only true love. The news that he was planning to elope with Laura would have been more than a heartbreak. It would have been a profound betrayal, a public humiliation she could not endure. In the unforgiving code of the mountains, this was an offense that demanded a reckoning. The legend suggests that Anne, a woman scorned, decided that if she couldn't have Tom, no one would. Laura Foster wasn't just a rival. She was a testament to Anne's failure to hold her man, and she had to be erased. With this new suspicion, people began to re-examine the facts. The star witness, Pauline Foster, who had the convenient visions that led to the body, where did she live and work? On Anne Melton's farm. She was under Anne's roof, subject to her influence and her will every single day. Was it truly a supernatural vision that led Pauline to the grave, or was it a carefully planted suggestion from a manipulative mistress, a calculated move to have the body found only after Tom Dula was long gone and suspicion had hardened against him? Suddenly, Anne's behavior after the disappearance seemed less like that of a concerned cousin and more like that of a cold, calculating conspirator. Her composure was seen as unnatural, her lack of public grief suspicious. The very legal maneuvering that separated her trial from Tom's, once seen as a procedural matter, now looked like a deliberate tactic to keep her off the witness stand and prevent her from being questioned under oath. The community started to see not a woman caught in a tragedy, but a puppeteer pulling the strings from the shadows. The theory that began to form was as simple as it was terrifying. Anne had killed Laura in a fit of jealous rage, and Tom, arriving to find the horrifying deed done, made a fateful choice out of love and loyalty to protect her and take the blame himself. But there was another power at play in these hills, one older and more relentless than a lover's jealousy or a man's guilt. It was the silent, brooding force of the Foster clan itself. In the world of Appalachia, family was everything. It was law, government, and army all rolled into one. The Fosters were a proud and numerous clan, their roots sunk deep into the rocky soil of Wilkes County. To dishonor one was to dishonor them all, and what had happened to Laura was the ultimate dishonor. Their motive was not simple grief. It was a cold, burning rage against the shame that had been brought upon their name. Tom Dula, the charming outsider who had seduced their daughter, allegedly gotten her pregnant. and was the man she died with, was a walking monument to their family's humiliation. Whether he struck the fatal blow or not was almost secondary. He was the source of the rot, the cause of the scandal that was now the talk of 3 counties. They needed more than justice. They needed a cleansing. And for that, blood had to be paid. This created a climate of quiet, immense pressure. It's a theory whispered to this day that the Fosters, realizing they might never get the satisfaction of seeing the clever Anne Melton convicted in a court of law, decided to wage their own war in the shadows. They began to shape the narrative through social pressure and communal expectation. Witnesses who might have spoken of Anne's volatile temper or seen her near the scene found it easier to stay silent. Rumors that pointed away from Tom were mysteriously quashed, while those that implicated him grew louder and more detailed with every telling. Pauline Foster, the key witness, was caught in the middle of this storm. Was she just Anne Melton's pawn, or was she also a member of the Foster clan, being urged by her own kin to point the finger where it would do the most good for the family's honor? In this version of the story, the tragedy was no longer just a crime of passion. It was a battle between a lone man and an entire clan, a clan that had decided, with or without a court, that Tom Dooler was the one who had to hang. With Laura Foster's body discovered and Tom Dooler a fugitive, the investigation snapped into a singular, frantic focus: the manhunt. The law in those days wasn't a team of detectives meticulously gathering forensic evidence. It was a posse of determined men on horseback, driven by a raw sense of mountain justice. Led by former Wilkes County Sheriff William Dooler, a relative of Tom's, they picked up the trail. But Tom Dooler was a child of these mountains. He had a considerable head start, and the wilderness was his greatest ally. He vanished into the green labyrinth of the Appalachians like a ghost into the fog. For weeks, the posse tracked him through the rugged peaks and dense forests that straddled the border of North Carolina and Tennessee. The mountains themselves seemed to conspire to hide him, offering up 1,000 false trails, 100 hidden hollows where a man could disappear for years. Every snapped twig that wasn't his, every cold campfire that belonged to a hunter, was a dead end that cost the posse precious time. The pursuit was a grueling testament to the land's indifference. It was a place that could just as easily protect a fugitive as it could swallow a victim. The trail grew cold, and it seemed as though Tom Dooler had succeeded, that he had been consumed by the wilderness he knew so well. It wasn't until a legendary mountain lawman, Colonel James Grayson, got word that a man matching Tom's description was working as a farmhand near the Tennessee border that the chase had its break. Grayson and the posse cornered Tom, who gave himself up without a fight. They had their man. To the outside world, this seemed to be the end of it. The promising lead hadn't evaporated, it had been captured. But this capture was its own kind of false trail. It provided an easy answer, a simple villain, and in doing so, it slammed the door on any other line of inquiry. With Tom in custody, no one seriously investigated Anne Melton. Her convenient alibi, provided by her own farmhands, was accepted without much question. The possibility of another party being involved, a drifter or a rival unknown to the community, was never explored. The entire weight of the state's investigation was now focused on building a case against the man they had chased across the mountains. This created a deep and growing frustration. They had their killer, but the evidence was flimsy, built on circumstance, motive, and his flight. They had no murder weapon, no confession, and their star witness was a woman whose mind was crumbling from disease. The community, which had craved a swift and certain resolution, was left with a captive but no real closure. The single-minded pursuit of Tom Dooler had felt like a straight path to justice, but it had led them to a dead end, with the suspect in chains and the truth still hiding somewhere back in the mountain mists. When the lawmen brought Tom Dooler back to Wilkes County in chains, they believed the hardest part was over. They were wrong. As they began to build their case, they ran into a wall, not a wall of brick and mortar, but of downcast eyes, tight-lipped mouths, and sudden, convenient deafness. Neighbors who had known the families for generations suddenly saw nothing. Men who drank with Tom at the local tavern heard nothing. Women who quilted with Anne and Laura knew nothing. The mountain had drawn a breath and held it, wrapping itself in a thick, impenetrable code of silence. This silence was born of a deep and primal fear. Anne Melton cast a long, cold shadow over the community. The whispers that she was the true killer were pervasive, and with those whispers came a chilling question. If she was capable of stabbing her own cousin in a jealous rage, what would she do to a neighbor who dared to speak against her? Her husband, James Melton, was a respected and established farmer. To accuse his wife was to make a powerful enemy. It was a risk no one was willing to take. Self-preservation was a lesson the mountains taught well, and it often meant keeping your mouth shut and your eyes on your own affairs. But the silence was more complex than simple fear. It was also a matter of tangled loyalties. The Doulas, the Fosters, the Meltons, these families were all interwoven by blood and marriage, a complex tapestry of kinship that stretched back generations. To testify against Anne or Tom was not just to accuse an individual, it was to draw a line in the sand between families, to risk a feud that could simmer for generations, passed down like a rusty rifle. Faced with the choice of speaking to outside lawmen from Statesville or maintaining the fragile peace within their own clan, the people of Wilkes County chose their own. The cost of breaking this code was made terrifyingly clear. An old story, told for 100 years, speaks of a woman who lived on the trail Laura Foster had taken. She let it be known that she might have seen Anne Melton walking towards the meeting spot on that fateful morning. A few nights later, her barn burned to the ground in a blaze that lit up the hollow. No one was ever caught, but the message was as clear as the fire itself. Keep silent, or what you own will turn to ash. After that, the whispers died, and the silence became absolute. The community understood. The price of the truth was too high. For nearly 2 years, the case against Tom Doula was a frustrating stalemate built on whispers and circumstance. His first trial ended in a guilty verdict, but it was overturned on appeal. A second trial was underway, and his brilliant lawyer, former Governor Zebulon Vance, was systematically dismantling the prosecution's flimsy case. He had painted Pauline Foster as a delusional, unreliable witness and pointed the finger of blame squarely at the calculating Anne Melton. It began to look as if Tom Doula, despite the mountain of public opinion against him, might just walk free. The truth seemed destined to remain buried, a secret lost to the silence of the hills. The turning point didn't come from a dramatic courtroom revelation or a newly discovered piece of evidence. It came from a slip of paper, a desperate note scrawled in a jail cell. As his second trial drew to a close and the possibility of acquittal seemed within reach, Tom Doula did something inexplicable. He took a pencil and a scrap of paper and wrote 4 simple, devastating words. I and Anne Melton. He passed this note to one of his lawyers, a cryptic and ambiguous message that could be interpreted in a dozen different ways. Was it a confession? A last-ditch effort to implicate the woman he felt had betrayed him? Or was it, as many have come to believe, the key to a hidden truth? The most enduring theory is that this note was Tom's attempt to articulate a complex reality. That he and Anne Melton were both involved, but not in the way anyone suspected. The note wasn't a confession of murder, but a confession of conspiracy. It was his way of saying that the plan had never been to kill Laura, but for Tom and Anne to run away together, and that Laura had somehow gotten caught in the crossfire of their own desperate escape plan. This tiny, forgotten clue, preserved in the state archives, throws the entire accepted narrative into chaos. It suggests a truth far more complicated than a simple love triangle murder. It points not to a lone killer, but to a shared plot, a pact between 2 lovers that went horribly wrong. The note changes everything. It reframes Tom's flight not as the act of a guilty murderer, but as the panicked escape of a man caught in a catastrophe of his own making. It was the moment the legend cracked, revealing a deeper, darker, and more tragic story beneath the surface. The trial was no longer just about who killed Laura Foster. It was about unraveling the true nature of the pact between Tom Dula and Ann Melton. The courtroom in Statesville held its breath. Governor Vance's powerful defense had cast a deep and profound doubt on the state's case. Tom Dula, the man everyone had condemned, now seemed like a victim himself, a pawn in a game played by a far more cunning mind. Acquittal felt not just possible, but likely. It was in this moment of rising hope that Tom Dula's own hand sealed his fate. The cryptic note, "I and Ann Melton," was seen by the jury not as a complex clue, but as a simple, damning confession of partnership. The ambiguity that Tom may have intended was lost. The prosecution finally had the link they needed. But the jury's verdict is not the end of this story. For the true unmasking didn't happen under the authority of a judge, but in the enduring judgment of the mountain people, a verdict whispered from one generation to the next. And in that court, the true killer was, and always has been, Ann Melton. She was the dark heart of the tragedy, the hand that held the knife. She was the architect of Laura Foster's death and Tom Dula's downfall. Tom's note was not a confession of his own guilt in the murder, but his last, desperate attempt to point towards hers without fully betraying the woman he still inexplicably loved. He couldn't bring himself to write the words "Ann killed her," but he could link their names together in the crime, a final, futile gesture towards a truth he knew would be buried with him. He was admitting his part in the conspiracy of silence, in the cover-up, and in the tragic aftermath, hoping someone would see the truth between the lines. Her motive was a poison as old as humanity itself, a possessive, all-consuming jealousy. Ann Melton had shared Tom Dula, but she had never accepted it. When she learned that Tom and Laura were not just courting, but were planning to elope, to build a life together far from her influence, it was a betrayal she could not stomach. It was an intolerable public declaration that she had lost. The legend, which many hold as gospel, says that Ann, under the pretense of making peace, lured her cousin Laura to that secluded hillside. There, the womanly truce turned into a bitter confrontation, and Ann's simmering rage exploded into a single, brutal act of violence. Tom Dula's only crime that day was one of love and loyalty. He arrived at the meeting spot not to kill Laura, but to run away with her, or perhaps to finally break things off. Instead, he found Ann, spattered with blood, standing over the lifeless body of her cousin. In that horrifying moment, faced with an impossible choice, he chose Ann. He chose to protect the woman who had been his first love, the captivating, manipulative woman who held his heart in a vice. His crime was not murder, but the digging of a shallow grave and the weaving of a lie that would cost him his life. The court of law would hang Tom Dula. But the court of the mountains knew better. They unmasked a killer far more frightening than a reckless young man, a beautiful, jealous woman who let the man she claimed to love swing from a rope for a crime she committed. The true climax of this story is not a guilty verdict, but the chilling realization that the real monster walked free, leaving a ghost and a legend in her wake. Let us now go back to that hillside, not as speculators, but as silent witnesses to the truth the mountains have held for over a century. The sun was warm that morning, filtering through the leaves of the old oak trees. Laura Foster arrived first, her heart aflutter with a mix of hope and nervous fear. In her hands, she clutched a small bundle of clothes, everything she needed to start a new life with the man she loved. She believed she was there to meet Ann for a final, difficult conversation, a truce, or a parting of ways between cousins before she and Tom disappeared together forever. She was a lamb, walking trustingly into the slaughterhouse. When Ann arrived, the air grew thick with a tension the warm sun could not touch. The conversation started with forced pleasantries, But the venom was not far beneath the surface. We will never know the exact words that were spoken, but we can hear their echoes. Anne's voice, once familiar, likely turned to ice. Accusations flew like stones, words of betrayal, of stolen love, of shame and jealousy. The beautiful clearing, meant to be the starting point of a new life, became a courtroom with only one judge and one executioner. There was a sudden, violent movement, a flash of steel in the dappled sunlight. It was not followed by a blood-curdling scream, but by a sharp, surprised gasp from Laura, a sound of disbelief more than pain. That sound was cut short, replaced by a soft thud as her body crumpled onto the blanket of leaves. The small bundle of clothes fell from her grasp, spilling a pathetic collection of folded dresses and girlish dreams onto the forest floor. In an instant, the birds in the surrounding trees fell silent. The wind itself seemed to die, and the woods were plunged into a profound and unnatural stillness. The hot rage in Anne's veins cooled to a chilling dread. She stood for a long moment, breathing heavily, the knife now feeling cold and alien in her hand. She looked down, not at her cousin, but at a problem that had been solved, creating a far greater one in its place. Laura's eyes were open, staring blankly at a sky she could no longer see. The silence of the clearing was now an accusation, a ringing void that was louder than any scream. Sometime later, Tom Dula walked into that clearing. He carried his fiddle in one hand and a shovel in the other, ready to dig a fire pit for the camp where he and Laura would spend their first night of freedom. He saw Anne first, standing like a stone statue. Then his eyes fell to the ground. The world stopped turning. He saw Laura, unnaturally still, her simple bundle of clothes scattered beside her like a child's forgotten toys. No words were needed. A look passed between Tom and Anne, a look of horror from him, and a look of desperate, silent pleading from her. In that moment, Tom Dula was no longer a lover planning an elopement. He became a protector of a terrible secret. He was a man of a certain mountain honor, and his honor, however twisted, belonged to Anne. His choice was made in that silent, horrifying instant. He set down his fiddle. He took the shovel, the tool he had brought for a life-giving fire, and began to break the earth. The rhythmic scrape and thud of the blade was the only sound in the clearing, a sound of a man digging not just into the soil, but into a lie so deep it would entomb them all. The trial of Tom Dula was more than a legal proceeding. It was a circus. Moved from the heated atmosphere of Wilkes County to the more neutral ground of Statesville, it became the sensation of the decade. The courtroom was packed every day with a sweating, breathless crowd, hungry for every sordid detail. You have to imagine the scene, a clash between the raw, unwritten code of the mountains and the starched collar justice of the state. At the head of Tom's defense was none other than Zebulon Vance, a celebrated former governor and Confederate officer, the most famous lawyer in North Carolina. The stage was set for a battle of titans over the life of one troubled fiddler. The prosecution built its case on a rickety foundation of circumstance. They presented their motive. Tom killed Laura to be free to continue his affair with Anne Melton, or to silence her about a pregnancy or a shameful disease. They leaned heavily on his flight to Tennessee, painting it as a clear admission of guilt. And at the center of their case was their star witness, Pauline Foster, who recounted her strange visions and claimed Anne Melton had confessed to her. But under the searing cross-examination of Governor Vance, her testimony crumbled, revealed as the confused and contradictory ramblings of a woman ravaged by illness. Vance's defense was a masterpiece of oratory and deflection. He portrayed his client not as a killer, but as a simple, honorable soldier who had been ensnared by a manipulative woman. With every question, with every booming objection, he pointed a long, accusatory finger directly at the empty chair where Anne Melton should have been sitting. He argued that she, driven by a mad jealousy, was the true murderer, and that Tom was either an innocent man framed for her crime or a foolishly noble one protecting her. He tore Pauline Foster's credibility to shreds, leaving the jury with a case full of smoke and shadows. Throughout the proceedings, Tom Dula was a picture of stoic calm. While lawyers battled and witnesses wept, he sat composed, his face an unreadable mask. It was not the defiance of an innocent man, nor the arrogance of a cold-blooded killer. It was the quiet, unnerving acceptance of a man who had already made his peace with his fate. Anne Melton, meanwhile, was safe. Thanks to a legal maneuver that separated their trials, she could not be compelled to testify against him, nor he against her. She remained a ghost, an unseen presence whose guilt or innocence was debated in the courtroom, but never tested under oath. Despite Vance's brilliant defense and the thinness of the evidence, the jury delivered its verdict. Guilty. Tom Dula was sentenced to hang. He appealed, and a second trial was held, but the outcome was the same. The legal system had its killer. But back in the hollows of Wilkes County, the verdict was met with a grim, knowing shake of the head. This wasn't justice, it was a convenience. They had hanged the fool and let the serpent go free. On the gallows, on May 1st, 1868, Tom Dula played a final mournful tune on his fiddle. He then stood before the massive crowd and spoke his last, carefully chosen words. "Gentlemen, I stand before you today, and I declare that I am the only person who had a hand in the death of Laura Foster." It sounded like a confession, but it wasn't. He didn't say he killed her. He said he had a hand in her death, the hand that dug the grave, the hand that held the secret. With those ambiguous words, he plunged the gallows into the ground and stepped into legend, a martyr in the eyes of his people, protecting the woman he loved to the very end. The gallows rope that snapped Tom Dula's neck did not end the story. It merely scattered the characters to their own private hells. The tragedy rippled outwards, forever altering the lives of everyone it had touched. For Anne Melton, the woman at the dark heart of it all, there was no victory, no triumphant return to her life with Tom gone. She had won, but the prize was a life sentence of suspicion and isolation. She returned to her husband, James, but she was a pariah in her own community. The whispers followed her like a shroud. Neighbors would fall silent when she entered a room, their eyes holding a cold, knowing judgment that no court could ever deliver. She was a ghost among the living, haunted by the memory of the man who died for her and the cousin she sent to a shallow grave. The legend of her end is as dark as her life. Years later, ravaged by the same syphilis that had plagued them all, Anne lay on her deathbed. As a furious storm, a true mountain tempest, clawed at the walls of her home, she was seized by a final, terrifying need to confess. The local myth, told as gospel, claims that as she drew a rattling breath to speak the truth of what happened on that hillside, a bolt of lightning struck the chimney. The roar of thunder was deafening, shaking the house to its foundation and drowning out her final words. Her secret, whatever it was, died with her, snatched away by an act of God or the devil, leaving only the legend behind. The lives of the other players were just as irrevocably broken. Pauline Foster, the tragic and unreliable witness, was cast out. Her reputation was in tatters, and her mind continued its slow, merciless decay. She died not long after, a victim of her disease and a pawn in a game far beyond her comprehension. Laura's father lived out his days with the hollow ache of a man who got a conviction, but not the truth. His daughter's memory forever tied to scandal and a famous murder ballad. The Dula family bore the shame of the gallows. They retrieved Tom's body and buried him in their family plot, his grave marked by a simple fieldstone that is still visited to this day. They never believed he was a murderer, but a fool who died for a wicked woman's love. They lived with the stigma, their name now synonymous with the most infamous crime in North Carolina history. Even the men who were merely actors in the final drama were marked by it. Governor Zebulon Vance went on to serve as a U.S. Senator, But the Dula case remained one of his most famous, a rare and public loss in a celebrated career. Colonel James Grayson, the lawman who captured Tom, was further cemented as a folk hero, the man who always got his man. But for the families at the heart of the story, there was no glory, no moving on. The crime left a wound on the soul of Wilkes County, a scar that would be passed down through generations, a cautionary tale of love, jealousy, and the devastating price of silence. The rope that hanged Tom Dula didn't silence his story. It just gave it a voice that would echo for a century and a half. The traces of this tragedy have not vanished. They are etched into the very soil of Wilkes County, tangible reminders that this is not just a legend, but a true story of love and death. You can still visit Tom Dula's grave today. It's a simple plot of family land marked by a weathered stone, where visitors often leave small tokens, a coin, a flower, a guitar pick, offerings left for the ghost of a handsome fiddler. Miles away, Laura Foster lies in a different cemetery, her final resting place far from the man she died for, their separation in death as permanent as it was in life. But the most powerful remnant is not made of stone, it's made of music. Long before the lawyers and the newspapers, the people of the mountains preserved the story in the only way they knew how. They sang about it. The original folk ballad of Tom Dooley was a raw, haunting piece of oral history passed down through generations. Its verses were often darker and more complex than the famous version, with lines that pointed the finger directly at Anne Melton, capturing the community's true belief. It was this local ballad that kept the memory alive, a flickering candle in the dark hollows of time. Then, in 1958, a clean-cut group of folk singers called the Kingston Trio recorded their version. They simplified the narrative, smoothed out the rough edges, and turned a sordid Appalachian murder into a romantic, chart-topping hit. Their song, with its catchy rhythm and mournful refrain, blasted the story across the world. It cemented the name Tom Dooley in the popular imagination and ensured that this small-town tragedy would achieve a strange and lasting immortality. The song is the story's living ghost, a tune that drifts on the radio waves, its tragic origins unknown to most who hum along. Today, if you travel those winding roads in Wilkes County and talk to the old-timers, the story is still there, living and breathing. They will point you toward the hills where Laura's body was found, a place still thick with rhododendron and shadow. They'll tell you that on a quiet night, when the wind sighs through the pines, it sounds like the mournful notes of Tom Dooley's fiddle. And some will swear that if you're near that lonely hillside after dark, you might just see a spectral figure wandering through the trees, the ghost of Laura Foster, forever searching for the lover who was supposed to meet her on that long-ago morning. The world might have forgotten the details, but the mountains never do. So we return to the question that hung in the mist at the very beginning. What happened to Laura Foster? The answer, we find, is not a simple one. It was not just a crime of passion. It was a perfect storm, a tragedy born from a collision of desperate love, savage jealousy, a twisted code of mountain honor, and a community that chose silence over a truth that was too dangerous to speak aloud. The law, in its formal and rigid way, found a killer. But it never found the whole truth. It settled for a convenient villain and closed the book, content to let the deeper, darker story fester in the shadows. This is a story that teaches us a hard lesson, that justice and the law are not always the same thing, especially in a place where family loyalty is its own kind of law. It's a chilling reminder of how a single, violent act can poison generations, and how a lie, once told, can take on a life of its own. But more than that, the legend of Tom Dooley is a testament to the enduring power of a story. The courts delivered a verdict, but the people of the mountains delivered a ballad. And in the end, it was the song, not the law, that kept the truest version of the story alive. The Ballad of Tom Dooley is more than just a folk song. It is the final testament of a community that knew the truth and chose to sing it rather than speak it. It's the ghost of a handsome fiddler, forever playing a mournful tune for the foolish choice he made. It's the whispered confession of a guilty woman, a confession the thunder tried to drown out. It's the cry of a young girl, silenced by a knife on a lonely hillside. The courts may have closed the case, but the mountains never did. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. Or at least, as much of the truth as a mournful old song is willing to give up.